Bill, Day 2. Tuesday, the 19th of July, a conclusion of consideration in committee of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, Day 3. Wednesday, the 20th of July, conclusion of remaining stages of the Online Safety Bill. And on Thursday, the 20th of July, business to be determined by the Backbench Business Committee. The House will rise for the summer recess at the conclusion of business on Thursday, the 21st of July, and return on Monday, the 5th of September.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Leader of the House for the forthcoming business, although his government is clearly not in any position to deliver it. The Prime Minister is resigning. We're hearing on Twitter there may be cabinet appointments happening, but we've had bills cancelled this morning. There is no doubt, as we have been saying for months, that this government is simply unable to govern. Inflation reaches the highest for 40 years. 59 members of the government, when I last printed out a copy of this speech, I think we're up to now, have resigned. And economic growth grinding to a halt. The hours in post Chancellor spending his first day on the job asking his boss to quit, not planning for how we're going to deal with the cost of living crisis. Now, as backlog Britain bulges, his Attorney General has been on television announcing her leadership bid. This is far beyond merely a distraction. This is a Tory government paralysed by sleaze and scandal, and with a shameful act of desperation, a Prime Minister dragging the country down with him as he goes, but I'm afraid to say his party has propped him up to do it. Yeah. Even if the Prime Minister is now Prime Minister in name only, and frankly that situation does need to change, there appears to be no one left to drive the work of government forward in Whitehall. Now, the Leader of the House has constantly been telling me that his government is getting on with the job. They're clearly not. We were told that appointments would be made last night. We're still waiting for ministerial posts in the Treasury. Schools, there's no one there. Justice, environment, employment, housing, levelling up, the flagship levelling up policy. Levelled to where I understand there's only one minister left standing. When will these ministers be replaced? What qualification do you now need to be a minister under this government? Who knows? Who knows? Not just unable to carry out their basic functions in Whitehall, the business of this House can't proceed. And the Right Honourable Gentleman may know that the Paymaster General referred questions about council bill committees to him. So I will ask him, what is happening to today's Levelling Up Bill Committee that should have been going now for, I think, 12 minutes? I asked the Leader of the House, when will that be rescheduled? The Northern Ireland Cabinet Secretary resigned just a few hours ago. Where does that leave the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill? What is the plan for all of this? He's announced the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill for the 13th, 18th and 19th of July. Now, considering the seriousness of this legislation and the impact it has on our country's reputation, and the fact that this Prime Minister he is now a caretaker only, what mandate does this government have to proceed? If it's not primary legislation, it's secondary. During the passage of the Building Safety Bill, the Minister admitted there were unresolved issues that needed statutory instruments passing to protect leaseholders. Is there anyone who can sign these SIs? Mr. Speaker, in excruciating liaison committee appearance yesterday, the Prime Minister admitted that he'd met the former KGB agent with links to Putin without officials present in Italy when he was the Foreign Secretary. Now, I'm glad that my right honourable friend was able to ask questions, with your permission this morning, Mr. Speaker, but not a single one was answered. Yep. Now, this is on security, Mr. Speaker. If my right honourable friend is not able to get answers to questions when there was a context of a chemical weapons attack on British soil in which British people died, how is this a government that is functioning? And I ask the Leader of the House, with the greatest respect, can he tell us how does any of this look like a functioning government? Yeah. Now, week after week, the Leader has failed to answer my very specific questions on the appointment of a new ethics advisor. Now, given the new revelations, just the new ones regarding Lebedev, surely the Leader of the House could agree with me today and hopefully answer my question today that a new ethics advisor is needed. Could he tell us when will this vacancy be filled, and can he guarantee that investigations ongoing prior to Lord Geit's resignation will be completed? Because, Mr. Speaker, the first duty of any government, as we all know, is to keep its people safe. When the Security Minister resigns on the morning, we cannot allow this to drift into evening, let alone the weekend, and for this Conservative Party to continue to put national security at risk. Every single Tory MP, every single one, should take a long, hard look in the mirror, ask themselves how we got here, with a government that's collapsed before our eyes, putting the British people through an excruciating and dangerous act of desperation, with a caretaker Prime Minister, as my honourable friend has said, is even more dangerous as a caretaker than an actual Prime Minister. I may disagree with the Leader of the House politically, but I have huge respect for his office and for that of the Prime Minister. But, Mr Speaker, they propped him up, they were complicit, they have overseen 12 years of stagnation, declining public services and empty promises. We need a fresh start with the Labour government.
Leader.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I think there's a very clear difference between the two sides of this dispatch box. Now is the moment for calmness and for professionalism, not for ranting and not for overexcitement. Can I start, Mr Speaker, by saying the Honourable Lady mentioned national security. I think before we proceed, we should just recognise that it is the 15th anniversary of the 7/7 bombings. The Home Secretary is the Minister responsible for national security. She is in office. She is still the Home Secretary. She is in control of our national security, and there is no issue over our national security at any level at this moment in time. She mentioned the business. I presented the business of the House here this morning. That business will be delivered. That programme for the next 2 weeks. There are ministers in place to deliver that. And I would just gently say to her, she said, how are we going to proceed with the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill? Well, actually, we've concluded the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill in this House, if she paid attention. That bill is now concluded. I would say she's very concerned about legislation. There were only 4 members of the opposition in this House to debate that motion. That's how seriously they take the troubles in Northern Ireland. There were 0 Liberal Democrats. Only 4 of them could be bothered to turn up to debate that. She mentioned Salisbury and the issue over the chemical weapons. She supported a leader of the opposition who wanted to send the evidence back to Russia for them to consider. Just pause for a moment and think about who she supported at that moment in time. And I think it's all right heckling and saying we've got nothing to say. We're getting on with the business of government in a calm way. There are some bill committees that will not run today, but they'll be back up and running very soon. And she finally finished with Lord Geit. I declare my interest, Mr Speaker, at the beginning of that, in that I'm assured that there are processes in place and those matters will continue to be reviewed and the results of those will come forward very soon.
Just shrug, darling.
Mr Speaker, as the Leader of the House continues to have confidence in the Prime Minister, my question requires a simple answer. Does the Leader of the House agree with the Prime Minister that if a complaint is raised against a Member of Parliament that is so grave that it triggers an investigation, that that Member of Parliament or Minister should not be promoted or continue on the front bench? So my question to the Leader of the House is simple. Does he agree with the Prime Minister?
Leader.
Mr Speaker, I'm not sure how that question is relevant to the business of the House in any way, shape or form, but if the Honourable Lady wanted to apply for an adjournment debate on any matter, she'd be welcome to.
Can I just say, those who were late, please don't embarrass me by standing. Can we now come to the SNP spokesperson? We're all waiting for Pete Wishart.
And we most certainly can, Mr Speaker, and thank you ever so much. And he's away, and hasn't the Leader of the House been curiously quiet over the course of the past 24 hours? One of the few Johnson loyalists that was left standing last night, I thought we might have found him chained to the radiator with his beloved Prime Minister in the bunker this morning. But can I reassure him, he's a rank outsider to follow his Prime Minister. I think he's something like 80-1 just now to take over from the Prime Minister, but I think that's even a long shot even for him. But what a mess they have made of this. This is a Prime Minister who can't even leave the scene without almost burning the house down. He's the first Prime Minister in history who, when receiving that tap on the shoulder from the men in grey suits, told them to go and get stuffed. Surely there is no way on earth that he can remain in a position as any sort of caretaker, particularly with all the big issues that we have to consider and address as we go through the summer period. He's more an undertaker than a caretaker. And what a joke. can I say to the Leader of the House of a business statement this is, with a government at half capacity, there's barely enough ministers to respond to debates and to answer the questions, and business has been cancelled for the rest of the day. What happens to all these vacant positions? Will they all now return to the post? Does the Levelling Up Secretary now get his job back? And Mr Speaker, we need to debate this Prime Minister's legacy, because he will go down in history as one of the worst Prime Ministers in history at one of the worst possible times. In just 3 years, he's managed to decimate our international reputation, our economy and our democracy. He will be their 4th Prime Minister in 6 years. Maybe the problem isn't quite with whoever leads the shower over there. And people ask us, why do we want independence for Scotland? Well, I'm not asking that this morning. Independence would mean we would never get another Prime Minister who we never voted like him ever again. And isn't it funny, the man that's trashed so much of the democracy in the UK, one of his last acts was to write to our First Minister to try and deny democracy to our nation. He's now gone, Scotland will soon be gone too.
Well, Mr Speaker, once again, there was not much in there that was relevant to the business of the House, but we await the Prime Minister's statement this afternoon. I can assure the honourable gentleman that vacant positions will be refilled as the reshuffle progresses today and tomorrow, and the government will continue to function in a professional way and deliver for the people of the United Kingdom.
Andrew Selou.
Much, Mr Speaker. Can we have an urgent debate in government time, because I've already had a debate in Westminster Hall, on increasing general practice capacity where we have huge increases in population? The Leader, I think, has similar issues that I have in my constituency. They exist all over the country, and I think it would show to our constituents that, notwithstanding what has gone on over the last few days, the government gets this, they take the issue seriously, and that serious work will go on this issue over the next few weeks and months.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I pay tribute to my honourable friend who's done a lot of work on this matter, and pay tribute to his leadership on this. He'll be aware that we are investing £1.5 billion to create an extra 50 million GP appointments by 2024. We want people to feel confident that when they have a problem they can see a GP face to face, but I think it is something which is worthy of further debate, and I know my honourable friend will continue to press. I would encourage him to seek a debate in this House.
Ian Mearns, Chair of the Backbench Committee.
Very grateful, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Leader of the House for announcing the business and the Backbench Business Committee debates for the 14th of July. And can I also give the House notice that on the 21st of July, which has been allocated to the committee, that it would be our proposal in the first half of the day to have a debate on United Kingdom sanctions for human rights abuses and corruption. And Mr Speaker, for quite a few years, the final Thursday before the summer recess has been a time which, when allowed, has been allocated to a debate on matters to be raised before the forthcoming summer adjournment. And the committee has agreed that it would be a fitting tribute to name this debate after Sir David Amess, who was truly taken from us last October. So our proposal is that this tribute would see the debate renamed the Sir David Amess Summer Adjournment Debate. Sir David was renowned amongst our colleagues for his regular appearances at our committee and his impressive contributions to pre-recess adjournment debates. So, Mr Speaker, the Backbench Business Committee would like to honour his memory by naming the debate after him. I've raised this matter briefly in the House after Sir David's loss and had the support of the then Leader of the House. And, Mr Speaker, I've written to the Chair of the Procedure Committee, to yourself and to the Leader to this effect.
Well, Mr Speaker, can I pay tribute to the honourable gentleman and to his committee for the work that they do. Thank him for announcing the debate that he mentioned, and also from the dispatch box offer my full support to his recommendation to call the debate the David Amess debate. I'd be delighted. I hope I have the opportunity to respond to him in that and other members in that debate, and I think it's a very fitting tribute that he's introduced.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know this may seem very mundane given the drama that's happening around us, but it's very important to my constituents. We've got several fantastic sustainable businesses, and I recently met with Kit Change, who make leggings and sporting tops out of plastic bottles that have been recycled, and Third Rock, who make sustainable activewear for climbing out of old carpets and discarded fishing nets, which is really important. But in my discussions with them, we've talked about the challenges and opportunities they face, in particular in relation to financing their small businesses. Please could we have a debate in this House about financing for small business who focus on sustainability and ethical sourcing of products?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question, and I would say it's not a trivial matter. I think the businesses up and down this country are the backbone of our economy. The government provides extensive business support for small and medium-sized enterprises, including sustainable businesses. The British Business Bank programmes are supporting over 1.77 million smaller businesses with £89 billion worth of finance. And I know she'll have the opportunity at Bay's questions next week if she wanted to highlight the fantastic recyclable business that she has in her constituency.
John Pryor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the comments made a few minutes ago about David Amis, my former neighbour, David Amis. One of the many consequences of rising energy prices is that hundreds of swimming pools in this country face closure in the next few months. This has been raised this morning under DCMS questions, but it's not technically really a question for the Culture, Media and Sport Department. It's more Treasury and Energy. Now, if we have got any ministers left, by the way, in those departments, could we have a statement on how this crisis, potential crisis, will be tackled with all the implications for future generations?
Leader.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. It is a very important one. I have swimming pools in my own constituency that are struggling with the rising cost of global energy. It's something that the government understands and takes very seriously. That's why we've poured billions of pounds in of support. I hope the local authorities can find it in their within their means to help and support those swimming pools that are under pressure, but there may be the opportunity at Bay's questions under the energy portfolio to raise that next week at Bay's questions.
Mr. Speaker, the 7th of July remains a very painful day for many Londoners. It's 17 years since 52 of them were murdered in London. 5 of those victims were actually people who had direct connections with Hendon, and include one of them, Anthony Fatayé Williams, walked past me just 2 hours before his death. But, Mr. Speaker, my constituent, 9-year-old Precious, has a neurodegenerative disease resulting in complex health conditions, including scoliosis. Her medical team have advised that she needs an operation to insert maggot rods into her spine to correct this. The use of these rods was suspended in 2020 due to safety concerns. However, their use has now been cleared for procedures in places including the United States and other countries, as a modified version has been implemented. Precious's family and the spinal team at Great Ormond Street have been waiting for over 6 months for the MHRA's approval. Can we have a minister come to the dispatch box and update us on the progress of approving this desperately needed technology for my constituent?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable gentleman and join him in paying tribute to the victims of the 7/7. I think I may have inadvertently said the 15th anniversary. It is right, it is the 17th anniversary. Just turning to Precious, I'm sure that the whole House sends our best wishes to Precious, and I can assure the honourable gentleman that the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency are taking this matter very seriously. I understand he has written to the MHRA's Chief Executive, and they will be providing a full written response in due course.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. To associate myself with the Leader of the House remarks on the 17th anniversary of the 7/7 bombings and remembering the 52 victims who died, and just a reminder that London will never be cowed by terrorism. At a time when we need stability across the government, we are seeing that the Minister for Policing has been appointed to another role. The fact that the Met Police, along with 6 other police forces, are in special measures does not give my constituents in Vauxhall the confidence that this government is stable. Can the Leader of the House please outline when we will get a reappointment in that important post?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question and for her comments about 7/7 and recognise the cross-party support on matters of national security. I can assure her that a reshuffle is taking place, is my understanding, that that's a very important role and will be filled very soon, and I'm sure then she'll be able to question the new Minister in due course.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Of course, as we commemorate the terrorist attacks on London, people should remember that the day before was a day of great joy, when London had been awarded the Olympics, and it was then tinged with sadness because of the terrorist atrocities that took place the following day. Over the course of the pandemic, the Department for Transport have continued to bail out Transport for London to cover the cost of the loss of income on fares. However, the Department have refused, quite rightly, to cover the cost of the Mayor of London not doing what he should have done in dealing with TfL's finances. Now, the current deal, Mr Deputy Speaker, runs out, I believe, next weekend. We desperately need an announcement from the Department of Transport for what's going to happen after next weekend in terms of financing for London Transport, because we cannot have a position continuing where the Mayor of London refuses to take the action that is required to reduce costs.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question and recognise that the challenge that Londoners will face if that transport system does not operate. He's right to draw attention to the amount of support that the government has offered, and he's also right to hold the Mayor of London to account. I will pass on his comments directly to the Secretary of State, but I hope that that the London Mayor will take firm action, get a grip of transport for London, and not rely upon the cash from the government that he's requesting.
Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. All of the events of today sort of started with the Prime Minister throwing the kitchen sink at trying to preserve Owen Paterson in post, which of course the Leader of the House was instrumental in as well. The Standards Committee has produced a new code of conduct. It's ready to go. We've published it. We've also published a new procedural protocol which would put in place, although there has been a sort of form of appeal in the past, a formal appeal through the independent expert panel, which is chaired by High Court Judge Sir Stephen Irwin. We can't use that, including for new cases, unless the government tables the motions, and I had hoped that we'd be doing that before the summer recess. I would urge him to think again about the last week and whether there's a means of us doing it before the summer recess, because otherwise there's a real danger that we'll be in legal jeopardy because we won't know how to deal with an individual case that might come along, which might be just as serious as that of Owen Paterson.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for the work that he's done and for the work of the committee. We had the final reports, I think, late last week, which the government is now considering. I know he's very keen to move forward, as is the government. I don't think it will be possible to have that debate before the summer recess, but what I'm happy to do is sit down with him at some point over the next week or to try and arrange a time which we can plan our way forward.
Daniel Kaczynski.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This year alone, my right honourable friend will know that we're spending nearly £190 billion of taxpayers' money on the NHS. Spending on the health service is increasing every year as a percentage of overall government spending. We're very proud in Shropshire. My right honourable friend, the member for Ludlow, and I secured £312 million for major modernisation of our local A&E services. Not a penny of that money has been spent 4 years after we have secured it. Can we have a debate in government time about the quality and efficacy of various levels of NHS management? Because certainly in my trust, I am starting to lose confidence in them.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question and pay tribute to the work that he does holding local health authorities to account in Shropshire. He'll be aware that the government has introduced a £39 billion package through the health and social care levy. That is a huge investment in our health services, but he is right to highlight that also has to go hand in hand with reform and restructure to make sure that that taxpayers' money is invested properly and is spent efficiently.
Harry Sherman.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Leader of the House if he will, of course he knows more about what's been going on in Number 10 and in the government than anyone else, but will he take seriously the fact this is a national crisis and a national emergency, and perhaps pro tem, just for the next 2 weeks and through the recess, there should be some serious cooperation between the opposition and the government front benches in order to serve the national purpose. And would he also, and I don't know, Mr Deputy Speaker, how we do this, when dear David was killed and when Joe was killed, I had the assurance that their families would be well looked after. Evidence has come to me that that isn't the case. Could we have a proper way of finding out how we look after the families of victims killed when they work doing their job as parliamentarians? Because what I've heard recently is not very reflects very poorly on this House.
To the House.
Well, I thank him for his question. I'm more than happy to pursue that away from the dispatch box if he wants to raise that with me privately and send me the information that he's in possession of. I think clearly there is a responsibility for us to look after families of those people who sadly were murdered brutally. I think it's also worth just reaffirming that there are support mechanisms out there for security, and I know through the Speaker's office and through the security services within the House of Commons, if any members are concerned about their own security or that of their family, there is support out there.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. At the Treasury Select Committee on the 6th of June, the now former Chancellor promised action in weeks on what he called the extraordinary profits of electricity generators, sparking significant uncertainty in renewables investment in Scotland. There is nothing in the business statement presented today which deals with this proposal. So before recess, can the Leader of the House restore confidence and help Scotland's net zero ambitions by confirming that the current government won't go ahead with these half-baked plans?
Leader of the House.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for a question. Of course, we have announced the oil and gas levy bill, which is coming to the House very soon, so she'll have the opportunity in that debate to question the Minister at the dispatch box. But I think we can afford a little time for the new Chancellor of the Exchequer to find his feet and to come to the House, and I'm sure she'll have the opportunity to question him when he does.
Terry McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I shouldn't actually be here at the moment. I should be in the Bill Committee of the Genetic Technology Precision Breeding Bill. Unfortunately, we lost the Minister yesterday. We have a new Minister who is even now swatting up ferociously for this afternoon session, but it's an incredibly technical bill, and it's not a very well drafted bill. It's very flawed. Does the Leader of the House really think that that Minister, no disrespect to her, but that she's going to be in a position to take us through the remaining stages of committee by this afternoon?
So I thank the Honourable Lady for a question. The Bill Committee will meet at 2 o'clock this afternoon. I can assure her that the Minister of State in that department is very informed on this matter, is right across the detail of that, and I'm sure the Bill Committee will proceed with great speed at 2 o'clock this afternoon.
Ian Paisley.
Very much, Speaker. I welcome the fact that the business leader has not listed any business on the Northern Ireland Protocol for the 12th of July, given that there will be celebrations about the Glorious Revolution taking place on that day. And a number of Northern Ireland members would not be available, but I do welcome the fact that he has listed for 3 days, 13th, 18th and 19th. Can I confirm that as personalities are changing at the top, that the policy on this matter, the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, will not change, and it is the government's intention to complete this business by the end of this particular session? And could I recommend to him the evidence that the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee received from the renowned international law expert Professor Alan Boyle of Edinburgh Law School, where he confirmed that all of his advice to the government is that the Protocol Bill does not breach international law?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman that the bill will continue on the dates that have been announced. He'll be aware it is a Foreign Office bill, and the Foreign Secretary remains very much in her place, and I hope he'll be in his place to scrutinise the bill as it progresses.
Marshall Kutova.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I associate myself with the comments made earlier by the Leader of the House and many other members across this House on the 17th anniversary of the 7/7 terror attacks? Mr Deputy Speaker, for the good of this country, we need a functioning government, and at this precise moment, we do not have one. There are many government departments that is without ministers. And now I have met with many ministers over the past months and also have written correspondence to them on very important matters that matter to the people of Battersea. So can the Leader of the House give me some assurance that I will get responses at the earliest opportunity and in a timely way, please?
Well, I can offer the honourable lady that assurance. There are ministers being appointed as we speak. Those vacancies will be filled, and she will get a timely response, and her constituents will receive the service that they deserve.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In Bath, we have soaring ambulance waiting times, NHS dentists and GPs in crisis, and a cost of living emergency bringing misery to scores of my constituents. There is no functioning government left. How is it possible that the Prime Minister can continue in office even as a caretaker amidst the chaos that he has created himself? Will he bring forward a debate and vote of no confidence in the Prime Minister?
Well, it's good to see the honourable lady back in her place for business questions. I know she's missed a couple, and I hope she's now well. I can assure her that there is a functioning government. The government, there are a few vacancies that are currently being filled. They'll be filled very soon, and level of service will continue at the high level it has for some time.
Twigg. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Consensus Leader of the House, in view of the Secretary of State for Defence's comments to the Defence Select Committee this week on the ongoing situation in Ukraine, can we have an urgent debate in government time to examine the need to increase defence spending and defence personnel?
Well, the honourable gentleman will be aware of the commitment we've made for extra cash for Ukraine and for the security the security situation. I hope he would recognise that that warfare is changing, and that the requirements of the MOD have changed over the last few decades, and that's why the MOD are reviewing what their requirements are. We have a Secretary of State currently who's very much across his brief and is very much in place and will remain so for the near future.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Before the chaos of the last 24 hours, I had been promised a meeting with the former Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities and Local Government over the issues affecting my constituents in Cardiff South and Penarth relating to fire and building safety defects, and the lack of cooperation there's been with the Welsh Government about commitments from developers that were done on an England-only basis rather than a UK-wide basis to remedy those defects. Would he be able to assist in getting me a meeting with whoever is newly appointed to that role? These are really serious issues affecting thousands of people.
Well, I don't know if the honourable gentleman is aware, but the member for Tunbridge Wells has been appointed to that Secretary of State role. I shall pass on his comments directly to him and make sure that we can arrange a meeting for him with the department as soon as possible.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister is permitted to remain in post until October following a leadership election, this means that the governance of the UK will be in a state of paralysis until that time, with over 25 ministerial vacancies and important bill committees cancelled across the House today. Indeed, it seems that the Prime Minister is still only supported by political giants such as the Honourable Lady for Mid-Bedfordshire and the Honourable Gentleman for Dumfries and Galloway. No wonder the people of Scotland are deciding in increasing numbers that they are better off taking their future into their own hands. But will the Leader of the House make a statement setting out the importance of a Prime Minister who has lost the support of his own MPs and is now unable to govern to resign immediately so that an interim Prime Minister can be appointed?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I understand the Prime Minister is going to make a statement later, and we await that statement with anticipation to see what is said. But I can assure her that government will continue to work away. She says that a number of committees have been cancelled. Actually, some of them have just been rearranged and will continue in the usual way.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I also want to associate myself with the remarks about Seven. Hounslow Council lost a wonderful social worker, Ajaro Ikiagwu, on that day. One of the key tasks of government are the basic functions that currently seem to be collapsing. For example, and just examples, the issuing of visas and passports. And members are not getting answers. So can the Leader of the House explain how the basic parliamentary tools of scrutiny will be addressed, such as answers getting written answers to questions, whether oral or written, where there are either no ministers or these ministers are so new they're going to take time to get their feet under the table?
Well, the Honourable Lady will be aware that the ministers, where there is a vacancy, those ministers will be appointed very soon, that the function of those departments will be up and running very quickly. And I can assure her that there are many talented people on the benches behind me that will be able to take up those roles. Well, they're probably all waiting by their phones, but I can assure her that once they're in place, they'll be ready to give her the level of service that she requires.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Deputy Speaker, after the wholly unsatisfactory response from the Minister this morning to the urgent question from the Shadow Home Secretary about the meeting with former KGB officer Alexander Lebedev on the 28th of April 2018 with the then Foreign Secretary, now Prime Minister, could the leader please arrange for a fully briefed minister to attend this House on Monday to give a statement to set out the facts of what happened and who was told, particularly in light of what appears to be a clear breach of the ministerial code and potentially a criminal offence being committed?
Into the House.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. As she made reference to, there was an urgent question this morning. There are matters of national security that are pertinent to this, and not all of those matters of national security can be vocalised from the dispatch box due to their sensitivity, but I will make sure I pass on her comments to the relevant department, and I'm sure they'll respond in due course.
Vendor Mishra.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was pleased to recently learn that Davenport Station in my constituency is to be finally awarded access for all funding to make accessibility improvements. However, Stockport Station, which had almost 4.5 million passengers per annum pre-pandemic, still requires significant capital investment to ensure it is safe and accessible for all. It is the 5th busiest station in Greater Manchester, but unfortunately we have leaky roofs, which often cause platforms to be unsafe, and lifts are out of use. If there are any ministers left in the Department for Transport, will the Leader of the House allocate government time for a debate on train stations across Greater Manchester to address these serious health and safety issues as well as accessibility issues?
Well, I pay tribute to the honourable gentleman for raising the matter. I think disability access to our stations is very important. That's why the Department of Transport have invested millions of pounds in our rail infrastructure up and down the country. He'll have the opportunity in September at Transport Questions to raise that again. I think Transport Questions on the 15th of September. But I know from my own constituency there are a number of challenges with railway stations that do need improvements to allow disability access.
Deirdre Brock.
Deputy Speaker. Open Democracy tells us 18 ministers have refused to publish official diaries of the meetings they held during the pandemic, and those include those of the Health Secretary and the Prime Minister. Yet the new Chancellor tells us we'll see evidence and transparency from the ministerial team and the Prime Minister in the future. Can we have a statement about the importance of the government ensuring evidence and transparency in governmental business, that government ministers' diaries are made available to the public for scrutiny, and also that distinctions between official, political and personal meetings are properly defined for the future?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady will be aware that there are very strict rules around these sorts of declarations. I don't think it is possible to publish diaries of all ministers. There are security implications in publishing specific diary engagements on a regular basis, particularly for some ministers that have security briefs. But there are very strict rules around what should be declared and the timelines of when they should be declared.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we know, it's the end of days for this Prime Minister. It's also the end of days for this parliamentary session before summer recess. The Leader of the House might not have seen the Leader of the Opposition interview the BBC this morning when he said if the Conservative Party don't get rid of the Prime Minister shortly, Labour will, in the national interest, bring a no-confidence vote because this can't go on. Will the Leader of the House guarantee that the 21st of July will be the last day of this session, or will he try and bring that forward to avoid such a vote?
The House.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've announced the business for the next 2 weeks. The House will rise on the 21st of July. We await the Prime Minister's statement this afternoon. I'm not about to preempt what he may or may not say, but I can assure the honourable gentleman that the functions of government continue and will continue to move forward.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The PCS Union are opposing the closure of Toxteth Job Centre in my Liverpool Riverside constituency, along with other centres nationally, and also challenging the proposed 91,000 job cuts across the wider civil service and the attacks on pay terms and conditions across government departments. Will the Leader of the House grant an urgent debate in government time so we can scrutinise government plans to negotiate with PCS to avoid centre closures and attacks on pay and conditions?
Well, of course, the Honourable Lady is perfectly at liberty to apply for a Westminster Hall debate or an adjournment debate on that matter. I think it is worth recognising that there is huge global inflationary pressure, and we must, as a government, act responsibly with fiscal responsibility to make sure that we do not add to that inflationary pressure, and that is going to require some pay restraint across the country.
Barry Gardner.
Last week, I raised at Business Question the issue of redundancies in the Royal Mail. And I want to apologise to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I said there were 1,400 agreed redundancies and 900 that were in dispute. I believe I may have inadvertently misled the House in that the actual figures are 1,250 redundancies at Royal Mail that were achieved and 542 that are in dispute. The Leader of the House was good enough last week to say that he would raise the matter of the disruption to service with the Secretary of State for Business, who I understand is still in his post. Has he done so? And if so, are we going to get the urgent statement from the Business Secretary about the disruption that is currently happening to postal services across the country?
Leader of the House.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. The direct answer is yes, I have written to the Secretary of State. I hope he will get a copy of that, if he's not already, of my letter in his inbox very soon. I know Royal Mail have also written to him, I think, directly, but I've not had a response yet from the Secretary of State. If I get one before he does, then I shall forward it to him.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Greater than the crisis in Downing Street is the crisis we're seeing currently in the Donbass and across Ukraine. However, the Prime Minister remaining in office is playing into Putin's hands and undermining President Zelensky. So will he convey my concern and that of many other members to the Prime Minister that he can't continue in office if he wants to support the people of Ukraine, and therefore bring a statement to this House about the impact of his behaviours on our foreign policy?
Leader of the House.
Well, I gently say to the Honourable, number one, we await the Prime Minister's statement this afternoon. I don't want to preempt what he may or may not say, but I think most people in the country would recognise that the Prime Minister has been the leading voice in taking the fight back to Putin and supporting Ukraine in the world. He's shown great global leadership on this matter, and if it wasn't for this Prime Minister and his efforts, Russia would now be in Kiev and I think probably across the whole of Ukraine.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the Yazidi Justice Committee published their report entitled State Responsibility and the Genocide of the Yazidis. Murder and mutilation of women, families, lives destroyed forever. It is undoubtedly, Mr Deputy Speaker, difficult reading. This report highlighted the duty of governments to prevent genocide occurring when a high risk has been identified. Given the situation in Afghanistan and the current threats to the Hazaras, I believe it's time to debate approaches on how the United Kingdom can help prevent future genocides. I ask the Leader of the House, I do it every week because I believe these are important issues to raise in this House. Will the Leader of the House make time for a debate on this very, very important matter? Thank you so much.
Leader of the House.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I've not had the opportunity to read the report, and it does sound quite a harrowing report to read. He is a true champion of religious freedom around the world, but it's something that the government does take very seriously. I shall make sure I pass on his comments to the Foreign Secretary, who I know shares his level of concern about the terrible actions around the world that some states commit.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Since my election, I've been campaigning on the issue of ambulance response times in Shropshire, and as a result of that campaign, local health leaders have been preparing for a visit from the Minister in the coming weeks to see how they've been doing to improve that situation. My understanding is that the Minister resigned yesterday evening, and so now that visit is on hold or postponed or maybe even cancelled. I'd like to ask the Leader of the House if he can bring a debate in government time on the national ambulance situation, because people are dying avoidable deaths, not only in North Shropshire, but across the House, and it's time we saw the government get a grip of this across the whole country.
Leader of the House.
Well, the Honourable Lady will have the opportunity at Health Questions on the 19th of July to question Secretary of State directly, but I hope she will recognise the huge investment that's been put into our health services up and down the country by this government. Ambulance waiting times are something that I know the government is working hard to improve on and to support her constituents and those across the whole of Shropshire.
Before I do that, can I thank the Leader of the House for his statement today on what has clearly been a very busy day for him and responding to questions for over 3/4 of an hour. So thank you very much. Point of order, Angela Eagle.
Point of order. Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. We've had two statements today where ministers have come to the dispatch box and told us that they have no knowledge of the things they're meant to be answering UQs on. This is completely undermining the point of having UQs. Certainly, Mr Speaker, when I was a government minister, we wouldn't have thought of coming into the House of Commons and merely saying, oh, I don't know, nobody's told me, I don't know what the information is. Could I ask you, Mr Deputy Speaker, I know that the Chair doesn't have any say on the content of ministerial responses, but this does seem to be a sinking of standards to such an extent that it's causing UQs to become a laughingstock, and this cannot surely be right for accountability of government ministers to this place.
I'd like to thank Dame Angela for her point of order, and as she has stated, it's not the responsibility of the Chair for either the contents of responses or indeed who gives that response. I suspect the only thing I can say is we live in interesting and exceptional times over the last 48 hours, but I'm sure the Treasury bench will have heard exactly what she has said and will get that through to the relevant government departments. Thank you very much. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Supply and Appropriation Main Estimates Bill, second reading.
Now. Minister to move formally. The question is that the bill be now ready second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. If you know, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. That being decided, the question is that the bill be now read the third time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. If you know, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the backbench motion on economic crime, law enforcement resourcing, and I call Kevin Hollenrake to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and to the Backbench Business Committee for granting this very important debate. And my honourable friend, the member for Barking, who is also working very closely with us together on this particular issue. Too often in this place we talk lots about legislation and not often enough about implementation. And if you look at the motion itself, the economic crime cost the UK economy at least 290 billion a year, and probably a lot more than that, a lot more than that. Our agencies are significantly under-resourced and very fragmented. And I'd like to say that things are going to get better. Actually, I think they're going to get much worse, and that's not being a criticism of the government or any of our agencies, although there are criticisms to be levelled. But the reality is things are moving so quickly in this space, in the ability of organised criminals to move money around, and these are people who deal drugs, these are people who traffic people across continents, these are people who fund terrorism, these are people who steal assets from foreign jurisdictions and foreign nations. I mean, it's just set out an example of how easy this is becoming. And these are all the same instances of running through one platform. A hackers group called Lazarus, which is actually effectively a state-funded agency for North Korea, which funds the North Korean weapons program. Hydra, which is a dark net drug dealing network. Grand Effects, which is run by organised criminals. Russian government agencies. The thing they have all got in common is they used a crypto exchange platform called Binance, run by a guy, set up by a guy called Chen Peng Zhao. Between 2017 and 2021, this is an investigation by Reuters about how those organisations used Binance to move money around, totally anonymously. Now, this at the point up till 2021 was regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, but still, that crypto exchange, which moved bitcoins and lots of other currencies through that exchange, totally anonymously, for those kind of enterprises, for people funding that kind of terrorism and other nefarious enterprises, all you needed to do to register an account on that exchange was enter an email address. That's all you need to do. No your customer checks, no your client checks, no ID requirements. Just enter an email address, which could easily be a fake email address. So that money was moved around totally anonymously. And the owner of this organisation, Mr. Zhao, had said to his own staff, as recently as 2020, in his talking about his staff, how he grows his enterprise, he was driven by one thing and one thing only. He's still driven by this. And this platform has now been banned within the UK in terms of regulated activity. But that doesn't stop UK people actually using it, because obviously that's how the internet works. But to his staff, he said, do everything to increase market share. He talks about know your client checks as being unfortunately a requirement. Unfortunately a requirement. And in the investigation by Reuters, £2.35 billion have moved around in this way for those nefarious ends. And this is just scratching the surface. A couple of £1 billion when we know the amount of money just washing through the UK is in the hundreds of billions of pounds. And the UK plays a key role in this, and it's a role we must acknowledge and we must take responsibility for clamping down on. But we're getting nowhere near that at the moment, Mr. Deputy Speaker. What we know in terms of economic crime is that 40% roughly of our crime now is economic crime, yet only 0.8% of our resources in terms of man hours is dedicated to the tackling of economic crime. So there's huge disparity. 290 billion a year as a conservative estimate, I think it is fair to say, which represents about 14.5% of our GDP across the UK economy. Yet, in terms of the application of resources, adds up to 0.04% of GDP. So this massive gulf in terms of the cost to society, the cost of this nation, and cost in many ways, not just financial cost, of course. It is, as I say, it is drug dealing, people trafficking, all the things we're trying to tackle. And yet the money is going out through the back door to all these illegal enterprises. We know Action Fraud reports and the impacts on individuals. And as constituency MPs, I think we all deal with individuals who have had money stolen from their accounts through things like authorised push payment fraud. And that adds, actually, according to Action Fraud's figures, and that's not the most fit-for-purpose organisation on this planet. Anybody who's used that knows that just goes into a black hole. That's what the Action Fraud is. And it's going to be revised, but again, just changing the name of something doesn't make it work. I think that's £2.35 billion a year goes in that kind of small-scale fraud, which damages directly our constituents and small businesses. According to... Yes, happy to.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way and would like to congratulate him and the right honourable member for Barking for bringing this very important debate here. Would you agree with me that to some extent our public debate about this is kind of stuck in a 1980s time warp where we are all still talking about bobbies on the beat, when increasingly we need to have bobbies behind screens patrolling digital highways rather than pavements on... and without that, the erosion of public trust in law maintenance, law and order, and maintaining the credibility of the system will continue to be seriously eroded.
Absolutely right. And he has much experience and expertise in this area as the former government's anti-corruption champion, of course. But he's absolutely right. We're tackling this in an analogue way to a digital era. We absolutely need to look at this in a completely different way. So I think it is about enforcement, it is about resources, it's about understanding the scale of the problem and meeting that with the right scale of response. But I've got to say, I think we need to look at our legislative areas as well, because there are some things we can do to make sure we get better bang for our buck from our enforcement agencies, rather than just more and more people. I think there's some other measures which I'll talk about very shortly. But on his point, I say at the moment 0.8% of our enforcement agencies are tackling economic crime. I think of the 20,000 new police officers that are going to be recruited, 725 of them are going to be dedicated to economic crime, which is better, but it's still only 3.6% of that cohort. So he's absolutely right. And the Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabularies say that in terms of economic crime, 90% are not even looked at. That is a shocking, shocking number. The FCA, who are responsible for overseeing money laundering in our financial organisations, and most of this runs through financial organisations, not just the likes of Binance, which are kind of shadowy enterprises, our main institutions, which we'll talk about in a second. So the FCA regulate 22, for money laundering purposes, 22,000 organisations, which is a huge amount. There are 5,000 of those as defined as high-risk organisations in terms of money laundering. Last year, they did 200 checks. 200, even out of those 5,000. And some of those are desktop checks in terms of money laundering capabilities. I would argue that we're never actually going to tackle this just by more and more people, although we do need more people. So, looking at this in terms of, it's not just Binance, and I'm sure sooner or later we'll catch up with the Binance, but I think what Binance will get at some point in time is they'll get banned or they'll get fined or something, and the German regulators particularly and the US enforcement agencies are onto them, based in the Cayman Islands, as you probably might imagine, but our UK institutions as well. If you look at our banks, they've got a horrendous record. HSBC was fined £1.4 billion for facilitating money laundering of Mexican drug cartels, the Escobars of this world, in 2012. £1.4 billion. It was fined another £64 million in 2021 for money laundering offences, facilitating money laundering offences. Standard Chartered in 2019, £840 million fine in the US, £102 million in the UK. MT Global recently fined in 2021 was fined £23 million by HMRC for money laundering offences. NatWest this year was fined about £260 million. Actually, the first ever corporate criminal prosecution by the FCA, and I welcome that, the first time ever that has happened this year for offences, for historic offences in terms of money laundering. UBS had the biggest ever fine, which is £3.2 billion. That was by the French authorities in 2019. Danske Bank, which facilitated £200 billion of money laundering. £200 billion of money laundering offences. It hasn't been fined yet, but it's been this has been identified. It will be fined. But £200 billion of Russian money coming out of Russia, being spread around the world, all going through small banks in Estonia, in Danske Bank. Horrendous. So we talk about how Putin funds his invasion of Ukraine, and he funds it by keeping this coterie of people around him, stealing Russian assets, making the wealthiest person in the world. There is no doubt about that. But we are facilitating this. UK companies were involved in some of the shell companies in terms of moving that money around. I could quote other examples of economic crime that I've been involved in on the All-Party Group on Fair Business Banking. Lloyd's HBOS, where there was proven criminal fraud that was proven in 2017, and the cover-up associated with that is an utter disgrace. And yet we're due to see the Dobbs review later this year, which will should identify the scale of the cover-up that Lloyd's have covered up that fraud that went on at HBOS. And then also we saw RBS, GRG, of course, which devastated tens of thousands of businesses, effectively defrauded businesses of their assets. All those occasions, all those businesses, all they ever got was a fine. Not a single person in any of those cases, not a single person in terms of senior executives has gone to jail. And that's what we need to do. We need to have personal reliability, because this stuff will just be seen as a cost of doing business. That's the reality. Very happy to give way.
On that point, my honourable friend has spoken with real knowledge and clarity around these crimes and in regard to constituents and the global impact, and the two are very much interlinked. And in my own constituency, I've seen many constituents impacted by hundreds or thousands of pounds, which is filtering into this global impact. How does my honourable friend think we can tackle this, that people don't feel this is beyond them in terms of the answers? Because we're talking on a global scale, but this is affecting individuals, and the two are inextricably linked, and they want to see action in regard to that.
It's absolutely the right question, and these problems are not that difficult to solve if people are willing to apply the right rules. So the money that she talks about from a constituent is probably is obviously a organised criminal, probably organised gang behind it, who's contacting the constituent, is saying, I can move your money over here, and they do that, and then that money's moved through a mule account, probably in one of the banks, major banks, and off somewhere else offshore, and then disappears off into the ether. Of course, the banks can clamp down on mule accounts. That's the reality. If they had the right incentive to do that, or the willingness to do that, this stuff can be stopped. But people will not stop it until it's in their interest to stop it. And that's what we need to make sure. Yes, we need the enforcement. Yes, we need the people. But we need the people that currently are facilitating that, which are largely UK-based in terms of this context, to be willing to do that. The UK plays this particular role within all this stuff in terms of economic crime. And the UK is seen as the place where money is laundered, not necessarily where it's kept, all that's different in terms of things like kleptocrats or Russian oligarchs, but the money is usually laundered in the UK, then off elsewhere, off into other jurisdictions, largely the US, actually. And the reason that is the case, of course, is a consolidation of expertise we have in the City of London, of which the City of London is something we should be very proud of. But that consolidation of expertise, both financial organisations and the advisors that sit around them, which are also culpable in this regard. We have strong regulations in some areas, very weak regulations in others. And particularly when we're offshoring, we're moving in terms of offshore regulation. And the UK has this particular relationship between domestic regulations and what happens offshore. Very happy to give way to the Honourable.
Johnson for giving way. And he's absolutely right. That point is one point I wanted to intervene on. The banks are very strict with local customers, and as they should be, by the way, and as it is right to do so. But unfortunately, as the Honourable Gentleman referred to earlier on, the movement from money, Mr Deputy Speaker, from Estonia to Northern Ireland was on the Panorama programme, I understand it was, where it showed £200 million of money moving. I'm very conscious that the government seems to focus upon the ordinary account holder and regulates that person in a very strict way. But when it comes to the big monies moving, it doesn't seem to have any level of regulation. And does he agree with me that that's where the focus needs to be, the bigger picture?
Well, I think he's right. I think the regulations are there, it's just that the penalties are not sufficiently appropriate. And they're sufficiently down the line. Although Danske Bank knew it was doing wrong when it was moving that £200 billion of money out of Russia into other parts of the world. It knew it was doing wrong, or the people within the organisation knew they were doing wrong. It just that it was their incentive to not do anything about it because they made a huge amount of money as it flew through their systems, of course. Now, if you're the local manager or even the mid-tier manager or even the senior exec, you're thinking, well, we're making money, nobody's going to find out. If we find out, it'll be a fine down the line, I'll have gone anyway. Where's the incentive to clamp down on it if I'm going to make lots of money out of it? Everybody's got their budgets to hit at the year, and everybody's got their targets and their bonuses on the back of it. That's the problem. The penalties need to be different. The enforcement needs to be different. The penalties need to be different. The other key aspect about the UK as a place to wash this money through is we have the overseas territories, of course, tax havens that work on the same basis of common law around the tax haven, be that Jersey, be it the Caymans, be it British Virgin Islands. So if you're going to launder money, you don't want to pay tax on it. So you want to make sure you put it through a jurisdiction with low taxation or zero taxation. So this is why the UK has got such a role to play in facilitating this, but also the role we need to play in clamping down on it. And clamping down isn't what we do really very well here. Our enforcement agencies have success to some regard, but we're nowhere near as successful as other jurisdictions, for example, like the USA. And if I can give you some figures on it, they're just far more focused on this. In terms of bribery, they have similar bribery laws to the UK. They introduced theirs in 2011. In 2020, they fined organisations in the US £1.85 billion for bribery offences. That's more than the UK has done in 10 years. In terms of money laundering sanctions, it's a very similar number. In 2019, the UK fined our banks £260 million the entire year in terms of money laundering offences, the US £7.5 billion, including £2.5 billion of criminal sanctions. If you look at almost every agency we have, it's underfunded and under-resourced in terms of tackling this problem. So what do we need to do? Well, my honourable friend, the Right Honourable Member for Barking, will talk about some other measures, but I'm going to focus on my key measures that I think we need to do. The one thing we need to do is ring-fence a budget for tackling economic crime right across the piece in terms of the UK to see exactly how much we're spending on tackling organised crime. And we need fewer agencies, and it needs to be more consolidated so the lines of reporting are less fragmented and more direct. Action fraud cannot just be a rebadged enterprise. It needs to be something meaningful, and the offences that are reported into it, people need to think they're actually going to be done something about. I was recently nearly scammed through WhatsApp, actually, and managed to realise it wasn't actually my son contacting me. It was some other person. But I think, shall I report that to action fraud? Well, what's the point? What's the point? Not going to do anything about it. So you don't do that. So many more offences that have been reported. The number one thing I think we need to do is extend something that the government's talked about doing. We have currently something called failure to prevent offence. You get corporate criminal liability if you fail to prevent bribery in your organisation. This was introduced some years ago, I think it was 2011, I might be wrong, but some years ago in the UK, failure to prevent bribery, also failure to prevent tax evasion. So you have to it's not that you have to just stop this happening, you have to put the rules in place to stop it happening. That's the key thing, it's what you can do to stop this. So if you then you put systems in your organisation to alert you to certain things that are happening, and you obviously also train your staff that you can't do bribery or facilitate tax evasion. We need to extend that to failure to prevent economic crime. Now, the government's been talking about this for some time. The Law Commission's reported on it. What it said is, well, we should do that probably for fraud. That's all we should do it for fraud. Not for money laundering, and not for things like false accounting, which to me is a big mistake. The other thing, it's very mealy-mouthed in terms of whether that would include personal liability for directors. It does say they could be if they had the mental, what's the word, the mental something. It's not past, anyways, it's the mens res. Thank you very much, Chair. That's right, whatever that means in English. Anyway, but, the guilty mind. The guilty mind, okay, there you go. But if you can prove they had a guilty mind, if you prove that the directors had the guilty mind, that they were actually participating in the fraud, you can then potentially go to jail. To me, that is wrong. That is not what the Health and Safety at Work Act said in 1974. What it said, if you fail to prevent accidents on your workplace, then if you fail to prevent them, then you can go to jail. And construction deaths dropped in the following year by 90%. What would happen if you put this in place, that if you are not preventing this stuff, if you're failing to prevent it, preventing what's reasonable in terms of clamping down on this stuff, then you can go to jail without having to prove you deliberately facilitated that fraud. That's what we need to make sure will happen. This would have make a fundamental difference to this whole argument we're discussing right now. We need to support whistleblowers. That's the other thing we need to do. Most of this information will not come from our enforcement agencies, not come from our investigations by regulators or from our enforcement agencies. They will come from people within the organisations. And currently those people are not protected. They are not compensated.
Just to remind the mover of the motion that the guidance is up to 10 minutes. And we're now on more than that, times 2. So perhaps with a bit of focus, he could now bring his remarks to a conclusion.
I've got so much to say on this. I do apologise, Mr. Speaker. Whistleblowers. One final thing I think we should do, as well as beefing up the numbers, one final thing I think we should consider doing. What we've done on unexplained wealth orders, we did it in the government's legislation it brought forward, we welcomed it brought forward in the last session, It's capped costs for unexplained wealth orders. We should consider capping costs for all prosecutions of economic crimes to stop these very wealthy individuals preventing our enforcement agencies taking them to court by just the fact they've got huge financial firepower, much stronger than ours. That's one other thing we should do. On that, I will conclude, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'm very, very sorry I've taken too much of my time, but as I say, I could talk for much more time on this, given the chance.
Remind him that at the end of the debate, he has 2 minutes to conclude, not 4. The question is, as on the order paper, Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a bizarre day to be debating a really important issue, and I'm grateful to the Backbench Committee for selecting, and it's a privilege to follow the Honourable Member for Thurston Moulton, with whom I'm working very closely on many of these issues. I'm going to say something a little bit general and then move to it. I hope you're not being too... Are you being... Mr. Deputy Speaker, have I got 10 minutes or a little bit more?
No, you're not constrained, but all I would say is...
I'll keep it tight. I'll keep it tight. Okay, but it is shocking, but it's true, that it was the tragedy of the war of Ukraine that got our government to start thinking about the serious threat that this country is facing at both our economy and our society, with the spiralling menace of illicit finance and all that goes with it. I've said it many times in this House, and I'm going to repeat today, that we will never, ever enjoy sustained good economic prosperity on the back of dirty money. We have earned the reputation on which our superb, successful financial sector now was built. We've earned it by being a trusted jurisdiction, and we must maintain that. Today, we're in danger of losing that trust. The US sees us as a high-risk jurisdiction. They see us as being very similar to Cyprus. London grad is becoming a popular term among many. We've moved off our perch as the world's leaders in fighting economic crime. Moody's have downgraded us. We're slipping down the ranks of Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. Everything is moving in the wrong direction. And it's no surprise, because as the Honourable Member for Thirsk said, this is massive now. £290 billion is more than a quarter of the total public expenditure of this government. And it's an annual figure. And in all of our views, those of us that are in this, concerned in this area, it's a conservative figure. And the latest figures, there were figures out last week by UK Finance, suggest that in 2020 there was an 8% increase in fraud. And fraud, of course, is the biggest component of economic crime. Much of the illicit finance, but not all, comes from Russia, Russian companies and from Russian individuals. And for too long, as the various select committee reports that we've had on this subject, for too long we have turned a blind eye on the threat Putin's kleptocratic regime poses to our economy. Why did we do nothing after the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006, or after the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in 2018? Two brutal attacks on British soil. But add to that the findings of a recent report by BuzzFeed investigation, where they established that between 2003 and 2016, there were 14 more suspicious deaths in the UK of individuals who were hostile to the Russian state. I'll just mention 3 of them. Stephen Curtis, who was a British lawyer, who helped the laundering of money, potentially billions of pounds of money, in the UK for wealthy Russian oligarchs. He died in a helicopter crash in 2004. Alexander Perepelichny, he blew the whistle on a multi-million-pound government fraud in Russia, and when he flew to Britain, he died of a so-called heart attack when jogging near his home in Surrey in 2012. The coroner's inquest said he died of natural causes, but evidence given, I gather, behind closed doors for national security reasons said that there was no natural cause determined. some suspect that he was poisoned. Boris Berezovsky, famous because he was key in supporting Putin and getting him appointed in Russia. He made his wealth during the collapse of the Soviet Union and played an important role getting Putin to power. He, in 2013, was found hanged in his home. Now, those are only 3 of the 14 cases. But the police, in all those cases, concluded that the deaths were not suspicious. There was no investigation or indeed no suggestion that these were Russian state-sanctioned murders. Although the US intelligence services did tell our police that they thought the deaths were likely sanctioned by the Kremlin. Were the police just incompetent? I doubt it. Or was there pressure somewhere else, either from our security services or from our government, to turn a blind eye on the possibility that these were state-sanctioned murders? American intelligence officials told BuzzFeed, the journalists, that Russian killers had been able to kill in Britain with impunity. And they said that one of the reasons for the reticence of the enforcement agencies to act was, and I quote, a desire to preserve the billions of pounds of Russian money that pours into British banks and properties each year. So as we debate today the failures of our enforcement agencies in tackling illicit wealth, we should bear in mind that the problem goes well beyond the funding, the skills, the effectiveness of the enforcement agency. If we are really to eradicate dirty money, we require action on a very wide number of fronts, as indeed the 2 APPGs have said, and we've put together, I think, a good manifesto which could form the start of concerted action to rid us of this terrible, terrible bad. And I talk about it, and we talk about it in this manifesto as being action on 4 fronts. We need smart regulation, we need much greater transparency, we need proper accountability, and we need enforcement. And enforcement is the issue that we're debating today. All those measures are interdependent. And I worry a lot that what we hear about the economic crime bill that should be with us in the early autumn is that the response of the government is too little and too fragmented. Reform of Companies House, we've been arguing that for a long, long time. Necessary but not sufficient. Reform of the anti-money laundering regulations, again, necessary but not sufficient. An open register of property ownership, property owned by foreign companies, necessary but not sufficient. We need action on many fronts in a coordinated way if we are to clean up dirty Britain. Today we are focusing on enforcement. Our performance is abysmal. Our record in successfully bringing the bad players to account is miserable, and our commitment to doing the job properly is questionable. And the evidence is overwhelming. The Honourable Member has already talked about some of the evidence. The Bribery Act was introduced in 2010. Look at the UK. We've had 99 criminal convictions and 6 deferred prosecution agreements. USA, very similar legislative framework, have had 236 convictions in the same period. We have never, as I understand it, I couldn't find it, and if I'm wrong, I stand to be corrected, but I think we've ever pursued a criminal persecution against a bank for money laundering or sanctions busting. We use civil measures, we never use criminal measures. In 2019, we got fines, we had civil fines of £260 million. In the same year, the Americans pursued criminal action and secured £2.5 billion against just 6 banks. And they secured £5 billion in civil fines. We have the FCA finding as the Honourable Member said, but I think it's worth repeating because it's so shocking. HSBC, we fined them £64 million in 2021 for AML failures. In America, nearly a decade before, they were fined £1.4 billion for their anti-money laundering offences. Chartered Bank, Standard Charter, it's a British bank. We ought to be the ones who are really responsible for ensuring that they behave themselves. What do we get from them? Fines for wrongdoing under anti-money laundering regulations, £102 million. What do the Americans get? £842 million. That's over 800% more. Yet we know from the FinCEN files that too many of our banks, too many individuals who work in our banks either passively collude with economic crime or actively promote and facilitate money launderings. And the banks that are implicated are so often British-based banks, HSBC, Barclays, Standard Charters, the biggest British banks. What we do in Britain is we pursue the little businesses, the little men and women who are trying hard to establish new businesses in here. And it came home to me very much when I chaired the Public Accounts Committee and we had the leaks relating to HSBC. They were called the Falciani leaks. And of course, in those documents, the ones that related to British individuals, there were more of them than there were, I think, from any other nation. There were 3,600 British accounts. At the time, the tax authorities said to us that about a third of those there was cause for concern. Out of those third, let's say it's about 1,200, they finally found 150 cases. How many did they pursue? One individual has charged, and I couldn't find in my search of Google, I couldn't find whether that individual was ever convicted. Look at how other countries dealt with it, and every other country managed to charge more people, fine more people, and get some compensation. The only thing that happened with us was the Rona Fairhead, now in the House of Lords. She was on the board of HSBC at the time. She was responsible for the audit committee, and I cannot understand how anybody with that responsibility couldn't have seen a red flag when looking through the accounts as to the profits that were being secured from the Swiss branch of HSBC. The only thing she said was that she declared that the whistleblower was a criminal, and the only thing that HSBC was to try and pursue the whistleblower and try and get him imprisoned. Fraud is the crime that affects now 1 in 11 adults in the UK, yet convictions for fraud have collapsed by 2/3 in the past 3 years. Cases up and convictions down. The SFO, in whom we had great confidence, the number of criminal cases that they've got under investigations has halved over the past 3 years. And there have been some disastrous failures in the courts through the SFO, with Serco and with Unioil, where they've lost the cases simply because they didn't share the information appropriately. They failed to disclose the relevant material to the defendants. I cannot believe there are lawyers in the room. I'm not one, but I cannot believe that they actually did that. I certainly give way.
I'm most grateful, Honourable Friend. She's making an excellent analysis of the situation. With regard to the SFO, we have a situation at the moment where they're being investigated themselves by a former DPP. They're being sued by the people they should be investigated, and they lack the money, the personnel and the powers to do their job. £53 million budget against a year against the hundreds of billions of dirty money going through. This is a pea shooter against an elephant, isn't it? This needs reform urgently.
I completely agree with those observations that have been so well made. The NCA have dropped their prosecutions by 35% in the past 5 years. And HMRC's record, who we don't often talk about, that's equally awful. They see their purpose entirely as simply getting the tax revenues in, which is important, but they also have a duty to ensure that anybody who acts unlawfully in the way that they deal with the revenue authorities, or indeed more seriously evades tax, is pursued. Yet they simply do not see that as part of their functions. Compare them with the Department for Work and Pensions, where if you have anybody who has any allegation of fraudulently claiming their benefit, they will be pursued with vigour by the authorities in that agency. We should be seeing a very similar attitude to what I consider to be a very serious crime of deliberately avoiding tax and not paying into the common pot for the common good. And if I just take one example which came up during my time as Public Accounts Committee Chair, there are some really egregious cases of where schemes are dreamt up which have no other purpose than to avoid tax. And Working Wheels was one that hit my desk. And in this particular instance, the person who wanted to avoid tax pretended that they were selling second-hand cars, literally selling second-hand cars, and then they sort of created money which whirled through the system to create a debt. And they were able to claim that debt against the tax liability that they got from their legitimate earnings. Chris Moyles was persuaded that he could become a second-hand car dealer. Saying to people that you're a second-hand car dealer is fraudulent. It's a fraud. And why that is not pursued with the same vigour as somebody who who tries to lie about their circumstances to get a better benefit settlement is beyond my belief. Basically, the HMRC, and it's one of our recommendations, should have the absolutely statutory duty to pursue wrongdoing with the same vigour that they try and pursue and get money into our coffers. All these agencies are grossly underfunded. They're all grossly underfunded. The government trumpet the £100 million that they're going to get from the economic crime levy, but it's peanuts when it's set alongside actually what the banks themselves currently spend on anti-money laundering, and certainly what other countries spend. Under Biden, the Americans have increased their expenditure on enforcement by over 30% because they define it as a security issue. And what have we done here? We've got a real cut of nearly 5%, 4.5%. So we've got lots of ideas which wouldn't require a call on taxpayers' money. We could enable a percentage of the files that are collected from successful action to be used to fund further activity and staffing within the enforcement agency. We could follow the American examples and say that costs incurred by the defendant, were we to lose cases, should in no way be met from the public purse. They just get no contribution to costs. Why should people who we are alleging of wrongdoing have, in relation to government funding, be allowed that? And then the thing which we will come back to, but on the sanctioning of individuals, we currently have seized the assets of a lot of, we have frozen the assets of a lot of Russian oligarchs, but we have no mechanism to seize those assets. And trying to move from freezing to seizing, where we are doing some work, in fact, next week to look at the practical changes that would have to be brought in to enable that to happen. Trying to ensure that we seize as well as we freeze would release more resources, not just for enforcement activity, but in this particular instance to help us with the reconstruction of Ukraine after the war. Staffing does have to grow. If we look, for example, at the suspicious activity reports that are received by the agencies, over 500,000 a year go in, with only 118 employees to deal with that. I feel my correct arithmetic puts that at 4,250 reports per official. In Germany, they have 500 per official. In Australia, they have 1,400 per official. All better staffed than we are here. And this is so much an invest to save activity. It is a nonsense that government doesn't distribute its resources in a way that enables that to happen. There is also the chaos of our existing infrastructure of regulation. It's fragmented. And as, again, the Honourable Member said, lots of stuff falls through the back hole. I get a lot of whistleblowers and people coming to me with cases, refer it to one agency, who then tell me to refer it to another, and it disappears, and I never hear again. The failure of the professionals to self-regulate is something that we must take on board. There are too many bodies. There are 13 bodies supervising the accountancy sector, and the Honourable Member for Thirst and myself met one of them the other day, and I don't think they had, I think, suspended 7 people in the last year. And if you look at that in relation to the activity that's taking place, the collusion and the facilitation of wrongdoing, it's a nonsensical figure. So we think we've got to sort out the regulation of the enablers and the regulator. There is an overarching regulator that regulates all the regulators. That too is to be sorted out, and personal responsibility has to be undertaken there. I just want to say two other things. The most egregious case that I've come across, which is a comment on all our regulatory systems and our failure to enforce, is one that relates to the Lebanon. There was a tragic explosion in the Lebanon, which resulted. It was in a warehouse that had fertilizer in it, which was supposed to be going to Mozambique, and it resulted in hundreds of deaths, thousands of injuries, and massive damage to property. And a few weeks after that occurred, I got a phone call from a Reuters journalist with whom I regularly work, and he told me that the company that owned the fertilizer was a British registered company. So I gave my usual comment of, hopeless, lax regulation, and didn't think twice about it. And then about 3 weeks after that, I got a number of phone calls from people in the Lebanon, the Bar Association and others. And it emerged after that that the company had been set up here as a UK-based company by a woman in Cyprus, who in fact was the company service provider. She put herself down as the beneficial owner. She obviously wasn't. She told HMRC that it was a dormant company. It obviously wasn't, because it was dealing in fertilizer. And it then emerged that the real owners were Russian Syrians, and that the fertilizer was going nowhere near Mozambique, but it was actually going to Assad and was being used in the barrel bombs to kill his own people. It's a shocking story, but it demonstrates how our regulatory infrastructure and our failure of our enforcement agencies doesn't just damage the lives of people here at home, but damages them abroad. And my very final story, which again causes me great concern, is after the Kazakhstan tragedy, where there was a demonstration against the kleptocrats, the regime who run it, and again the Russian soldiers were used to fire at the crowds, and people were killed. 2 British academics came to me and with research that they had done, which demonstrated that there were 30 individuals in Kazakhstan who were all involved in money laundering and human rights abuses, and whom we should sanction. And I used the privilege of the House to mention these 30 individuals in an adjournment debate, and then sent the list to the Foreign Office. A few days after that, I got a letter from one of the people I had named, asserting his innocence. Obviously, he wanted me to respond outside the house. So I acknowledged the letter and did nothing more. I then got a second letter with a phone call saying, had we received the letter? And my assistant said we had. I then get a letter from the desk at the Foreign Office asking me, had we received the letter? Were we responding? And what were we going to do about it? And I asked the Foreign Office why they were pursuing this and on whose behalf they were working. And they came back that they thought it was important to facilitate relations between kleptocrats and British politicians. It's a shocking intervention, but what it leads me to think, and I'll leave it this thought, what it leads me to think is the government really serious about bearing down on all this economic crime and corruption that week after week and year after year we talk about in this House? And if they are, they have to actually consistently, vigorously pursue every instance of it, and pursue not just the Russian kleptocrats, evil that they are, but kleptocrats elsewhere who are stealing from their people, killing their people, and creating instability in the world.
Yeah. Mary Robinson.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by thanking the Right Honourable Member for Barking and the Member for Thirsk and Malton, the chairs of the APPGs for Anti-Corruption and Responsible Tax and Fair Business Banking, respectively, for bringing this important debate to the House. As chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Whistleblowing, I would also like to thank them for making the APPG's proposal to create an Office of the Whistleblower a policy recommendation as part of their Economic Crime Manifesto. The recently published Economic Crime Manifesto presents the government, in my view, with good recommendations of how it can robustly tackle economic crime. Taken together, the manifesto's 4 umbrellas for reform: transparency, enforcement, accountability and regulation, work to stop economic crime from all angles and at all levels. I would ask the government to give proper consideration to the detailed proposals made in the manifesto, if they are really serious, as I know they are, about fighting economic crime. The motion recognises the enormous cost that economic crime has on the economy, of £290 billion a year, as we have heard, and calls for an economic crime enforcement strategy and for a restructuring of the fight against economic crime. This is much needed, and part of this, in my view, is the Office of the Whistleblower. The Office of the Whistleblower, which comes under the manifesto's accountability header, would go a long way to support the detection of economic crime by supporting the individuals responsible for detecting the majority of fraud. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, in their 2022 report to the nations, found that 43% of fraud is detected through whistleblowers, versus just 15% by internal audit and 3% by external audit. Whistleblowers are the single most cost-effective detection tool. Yeah. And yet, as it stands, there is little to incentivise whistleblowers to come forward with information. When they face, at best, when they come forward, being ignored, stifled and gaslit, and at worst, face having their careers and lives destroyed. When an employee blows the whistle, they risk retaliation, harassment, unfair dismissal and blacklisting, and as we have heard, in some of these crimes, much worse. Meanwhile, the bosses of economic crime gangs take money from hard-working taxpayers and funding from much-needed public services. While the knowledge of having done the right thing may be sufficient reward for many, I have to say, it's the personal cost of doing so which deters so many others. With little to look forward to but possible pain and suffering ahead, is it any wonder that people choose not to speak up? So,
To combat economic crime, we need, in my view, a shift within society, where people feel confident to come forward and are supported in doing so. Disturbingly, the National Crime Agency believes that just 20% of incidents of fraud are actually reported. And while the ONS Crime Survey reports more than 3 million incidents of fraud a year, the true figure could be 5 times that. While a whistleblowing positive culture will uncover more economic crime, which will need investigating, the Office of the Whistleblower would support law enforcement. The Office would be responsible for setting, monitoring and enforcing standards for the management of whistleblowing cases. It would also provide advice services and a clear avenue for disclosures. In addition, it will direct investigations and handle redress for whistleblowers. While current whistleblowing legislation only covers employees, anyone who blows the whistle, witnesses, contractors, many more, will be supported by an Office of the Whistleblower. If we want to combat economic crime effectively, we need to know about instances of it to understand the scale. If we want to understand the scale, we need those with the information to come forward. If we want people to come forward, we will need them to be able to do so without repercussions. Serious and organised crime gangs, funds gangs, and results in both public and private money commingling with drugs, human trafficking, arms dealing and more. At a time when both the state and individuals can least afford it, billions of pounds are being funnelled into illegal activities. This, despite modern, sophisticated crime detection techniques. Despite government efforts over recent years, we are continuing to lose vast sums to criminals. To me, this suggests a new approach in handling economic crime is needed. And I thank the Right Honourable Member for Barking and my Right Honourable friend for bringing forward this important debate. And therefore, I am happy to support this motion.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me start by thanking the Right Honourable Gentleman and my Right Honourable friend for bringing this debate to the House and for all of their work bringing together what is a just superb set of proposals in the Economic Crime Manifesto. This debate, even on a day like this, is important for us to have for this simple reason. At the heart of every autocracy, every dictatorship and every tyranny is corruption. And those who enable that corruption enable dictatorship, tyranny and autocracy. And as a country that led the Industrial Revolution, that is a proud hub of the global financial services industry, it is imperative on us. Just as we once destroyed slave trading around the world, so we must destroy economic crime around the world in the 21st century. That's why this debate is so important. So I commend the all-party groups on the publication of their Economic Crime Manifesto, and I want to draw the House's attention to the Foreign Affairs Committee's contribution to this debate that was published last week, because the conclusion that we reached as a committee set out clearly on paragraph 14 is actually a pretty damning indictment of where we have ended up. The substance of the conclusion that we came to is that it was this government's unwillingness to bring forward legislation to stem the flow of dirty money is likely to have contributed to the belief in Russia that the UK was a safe haven for corrupt wealth. That means that the ecosystem of wealth managers, of lawyers, of PR merchants, of bankers, of estate agents that enabled Putin's kleptocrats, they have contributed to the strength of Putin in Russia and therefore the prosecution of war in Ukraine. That is the conclusion that we came to on the Foreign Affairs Committee last week. I'll give way to one.
very well on the subject, as he always does. We've heard that the oligarchs use Londongrad as a playground, but not just for leisure and lifestyle, for criminal activity as well. And that is because law enforcement is too weak. What adds insult to injury is that when journalists and private investigators step up to expose what is going on, they are then subject to the institution in this country, the courts, through slap litigation, to being punished, and the people who are getting away with this are the people who should be in the dock.
Exactly. But my friend is absolutely right, because there are actually sort of 5 parts of the Economic Crime Manifesto I just want to very quickly run through, because they have got to be at the core of the next economic crime bill. So one of the virtues of us having this debate today, in this moment of great flux in our politics, is I hope to put on the record the cross-party consensus that there now is about what are the provisions that need to go into the Economic Crime Bill 2. Although many of us were arguing for it for a long time, we know that it was brought to the House and rushed through the House in record time for obvious reasons. Many of the amendments that improved that bill came from participants in this debate. But what we are saying to the government today, through the good office of the Minister, is that it did not go far enough. It did not begin to touch the scale of the problem, and therefore there is an expectation on the government in the Economic Crime Bill 2 that they look at this Economic Crime Manifesto, they look at the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they look at the text of this debate when they are drawing those provisions together. The starting point, of course.
An excellent speech. And I also recommend that the Minister, or the Minister responsible, when that Minister is in place, also reads the Treasury Select Committee report on economic crime, which also sets out some similar recommendations to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
You're right. I mean, the joy of the Minister in his position must surely be that members of this House have done the heavy lifting for him. Between us, we have actually sketched out a pretty comprehensive catalogue of the clause. We haven't quite put the clause numbers on, but actually I think we've got most of the measures set out. Those measures have got to start with information about the crime. That's why we need the whistleblower provision, because whistleblowers are so often the source of intelligence. That is why we do have to reform the suspicious activity reporting regime. That needs widening so that it bites on more organisations, like estate agents and so on. But we have also got to find a way of pooling the intelligence that comes out of those those suspicious activity reports, and then finding a way of focusing on where we think the harm is greatest. Because we've heard loud and clear as a committee, not least in New York last week, where our excellent consular team pulled together a wide-ranging discussion for us. Lots of banks and law firms and so on to say, look, we're just spending all of our time running platinum-plated processes without actually sieving the information intelligently and focusing on the 0.01% of reports where we really should pay some attention. And my honourable friend drew attention to the way our courts are being used to shut down journalists. That, of course, is the third piece of the puzzle. We need courageous journalists to speak the truth. We can't use English courts to shut them down in the way that is happening in London at the moment. So there are some changes that we need to make sure that we have got good information and intelligence. We then need to make sure the regulator is in place. The argument about a better Companies House is well rehearsed. It's just crazy that the kind of know your customer provisions which bite on so many commercial organisations do not bite on Companies House. And so they're recording directors with names like Mickey Mouse. Or, in some cases, they're still not recording directors at all. I fully agree, then, as a third set of provisions, that we need criminal liability on directors. I think the Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to sketch out the parallel with the health and safety at work provisions, which require people to identify the harms that their organisation may be guilty of, and therefore put in place provisions to stop those harms happening in the first place. Prevention is always better than cure. And then we obviously need to transform enforcement. We need to at least double the budget for the National Crime Agency. We need to at least match the money that the private sector puts in for law enforcement. And then we need to take steps to reduce the costs. That's the only way we're going to start getting unexplained wealth orders through. In America, they would love the power for unexplained wealth orders. We have to then explain to them, actually, that they're currently useless because we just cannot prosecute them successfully through the courts. There is, however, on top of that architecture, one further set of offences that I think we need to create. And this tackles the problem that very often in cases of corruption, the evidence that our agencies need won't be carefully organised and filed away here in Britain. It will be offshore. The evidence that we need will be offshore in jurisdictions that are not available to us. So somehow, in a situation where we can't onshore the evidence, we have to try and onshore the offence. And so what we need to think about creating are tough obligations on enablers, on company directors, and I would say on politicians, both in this House and the other place, to declare anything that is suspect or corrupt. We almost need a suspicious activity reporting regime that allows us to prosecute people for failing to disclose things that they should be disclosing. And that needs to carry a sanction that leads to civil proceedings for confiscation of assets. Unless we find a way of onshoring these offences, we will continue to be bedevilled by a problem of just getting hold of the evidence that we need. The final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I wanted to make just very quickly is that out in the world, people are saying, how on earth is it that this place has not acted on economic crime? And you can understand that people draw the connection between the flood of dirty money into our politics and our failure to act. It is a matter of tremendous regret that over £7 million of the £54 million that has gone into the party opposite in high-value donations has come from individuals with very suspect links to Russia. Now, Ehud Sheleg, for example, is somebody that has been discussed in the New York Times. He is deeply commercially connected with his father-in-law, Mr. Korpitov. The New York Times has recently revealed the way in which money came from the father-in-law to Mr. Sheleg from business activity in Russia. That was the suspicious activity report. But when a number of us here, reported it to the National Crime Agency just said, well, look, it's come from the bank account of a UK citizen, nothing to see here. This is nuts, not least because there is now further evidence that Mr. Korpitov is closely linked to business in occupied Crimea, and that money came out of that Crimean business into Mr. Sheleg's accounts in 2018. And worse, Mr. Sheleg's father-in-law is closely connected now commercially to Alexander Babakov, who has been sanctioned by countries all over the world. It's not a good situation for any of us to have to raise these kind of concerns in the House. Not least because sometimes we here in this House will make mistakes. I talked about Yuri Lopinetsky earlier in a debate on the 17th of January. I said that he had questions to answer. I'm glad that he has now answered those questions and given me reassurances that he has never had links to the Russian intelligence services. I'm glad to be able to accept those assurances and apologise to him for any distress caused. But it's not a good situation where we don't have regulators and intelligence agencies and police services that are able to tackle this kind of dirty money. Dmitry Lias, I'm afraid, is another example. There is a clear knowledge of his recruitment by the FSB, who got him out of prison. He has a criminal record in Russia. Intelligence sources I have seen say that he is, quote, absolutely dependent on the FSB, unquote, but he's a significant donor to the constituency of Esher and Walton, the home of, well, I'm not quite sure what position he's in at the moment, but he was Deputy Prime Minister last time I looked. The donation from Mr. Lias that went to the Prince of Wales charity was returned, but the Conservative Party has not returned it. It's not a good situation that we're in when we're having to discuss this kind of money coming in to political parties. And that's why I hope that part of the Economic Crime Bill provisions will be to make sure that the only money that can come in to a political party is from profits that have been created here in this country. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will draw my remarks to a close there with my thanks to the honourable members for bringing this debate forward.
Sir Robert Neal. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate both honourable members upon securing this debate and upon the APPG reports. A lot of the debate so far has focused upon what I might term high-level and high-profile international and economic crime, and I understand that. I'll touch upon that briefly, but then I want to move on. In relation to those very high-level matters, there's certainly more that we need to do to tighten the rules around money laundering. I do agree that the economic crimes bill that previously came before this House in relation to sanctions was much improved in the course of its passage, and we certainly ought to be looking to tighten and improve the provisions of the, if you like, second bill when it comes forward. There's an opportunity for us to do that. There are things that need to be done around corporate criminal responsibility and liability. The issue which the Honourable Member for Thurston Moulton referred to does relate to what's called in law the identification test. It relates to the mens rea or the guilty knowledge of the controlling mind and will of the company. And it's that requirement to identify the controlling mind of will, which in practice has tended to mean only a very small cadre of senior managers, which means that you cannot make the company liable for acts which are carried out by anyone who is other than in that controlling mind and will, that very tight-knit group at the top, who may be carrying out fraudulent acts for or on behalf of the corporate entity. That is different in other jurisdictions, including the United States, and reform in that way would, I think, be very helpful. And that's why, as the Right Honourable Member for Barking pointed out, it's actually proved easier in practice to prosecute small companies than it has large companies, because the management structures of the large companies are often more diffuse, and it is therefore, under the current law, harder to identify those who are the controlling mind and will. Changes there would be sensible. Similarly, extension of the duty to prevent offences is certainly wise. The Law Commission has recommended this in relation to fraud. I think we should be open to looking to go further. And one caveat I put, which I think the Law Commission flags up in the options paper, which it published last month, is that there is not always an exact analogy between health and safety at work offences and fraud offences, because, of course, to convict for fraud there has to be the additional element of dishonesty, either knowledge or connivance, as a phrase often used. And of course, dishonesty is not always a requisite element of the offences under the Health and Safety Act. So that's why there is a distinction that may need to be drawn, and why perhaps I haven't gone as far as I can. I don't say we can't look at that, but that is, I think, a distinction is important to bear in mind. I'll give way to my honourable right.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he care to venture an opinion on the report put out by the Law Commission on their recommendations about the potential for fixing the controlling mind legislation and legal approach? Is that actually something which could be improved sufficiently to provide a decent alternative to the failure to prevent, or is it something which is fundamentally unfixable and that path does not lead to success?
Does offer a sensible way forward, and I would urge the government to adopt it and work to implement it swiftly. They did so after very considerable work, pulling in a great deal of expertise and advice around it. So I think there's no reason why we couldn't move on the controlling mind test quite quickly, even if we need to look a little further at the duty to prevent test. Again, neither of those is unfixable, but they do offer, I think, a sensible way forward in relation to the controlling mind test, and I hope the government will act on it. The other matter I wanted to mention on the larger scale frauds is the work of the Serious Fraud Office. It certainly has controversy and some issues that it needs to answer at the moment in relation to the conduct of certain cases, and I hope very much that we'll have a full publication of Sir David Calvert-Smith's report into one of those cases. On the other hand, to its credit, with a staff of about 250-odd people, it has secured to the Consolidated Fund, through deferred prosecution agreements, of which there are now 12, something like £1.6 billion has actually been recovered through payments under deferred prosecution agreements. In terms of resourcing, if a modest percentage of that were ring-fenced and rather going back to the Treasury, were actually held and reinvested in the budget of the SFO and their allied crime-fighting agencies, that will be a massive step forward in resourcing them to deal with serious international and corporate crime. In one of the cases that we spoke about recently when we visited the SFO as the Justice Committee, the disclosure material had involved something like 1.9 million documents. That is a massive task to deal with. They could invest in more artificial intelligence for searching the documents. Some legal complexities around that, but doable. It's done in commercial civil litigation already, but you need to invest in that. So some ring-fencing and reinvesting some of that money we get from the DPAs would, I think, be money very well spent. But having then talked about those large-scale matters, I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, we won't forget in this debate that there's a great deal of, quote, small-scale fraud, small-scale perhaps in the global picture, but it's very big and important to the victims of fraud. And the Justice Committee carried out a number of hearings recently about fraud in the justice system. And the first point to take on board, I think, is evidence we heard from victim support, is do not think that fraud is a victimless crime. We were very, all too easy to do and to say. That was supported by the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners too. They reported that some 74% of fraud victims are emotionally impacted by the crime. You feel at the very least you've been made an idiot of. More often, you've lost maybe a small sum of money to a bank, but it's a lot of money to you. You feel vulnerable thereafter. You feel almost betrayed. So it is not a victimless crime, and we should never let that thought to be otherwise. And of course, that's of the people who are talked to because they've reported the offence of fraud. There are estimated to be 3.7 million incidents of fraud, but the majority of those, according to Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, are not in fact reported. So we need to do a lot more on that everyday fraud that we get. Of course, I give way to the honourable gentleman.
He's talked about this subject as well as the major frauds that we've talked about. I was shocked really to find out that in 2020-21, fraud accounted for 39% of all crime. The average investment fraud deprived people of £14,000, which is a very significant sum of money to an individual. Isn't part of the problem here that we're not taking this seriously enough? If we were, we would not be relying on action fraud anymore, which I thought the government had agreed to wound up and replace it with something effective.
I mean, I've got sympathy with that. It is extraordinary that it's nearly 40% of fraud, but only about 20%. Fraud is about nearly 40% of all crime, but only about 20% of police resources go onto it. So it is disproportionately low. And you're right about, the gentleman is right about the failures of action fraud. I mean, every one of us will have seen that in our own constituency caseloads, and it's very clear from the evidence that we heard that action fraud is not working effectively. In all, the stats we heard were that 876,000 frauds were reported through action fraud, CFAS and UK Finance in 2021. However, they reckon on average about 7 frauds a minute are being committed, but of those 876,000, only 58,200 odd were then disseminated for further investigation, and about 28,700 were passed on to the police from the National Intelligence Bureau, which is actually what sits behind action fraud. So even when you get there, if you do get through and get anything done, only a small percentage is acted upon. Ironically, when you can get them to court, the conviction rate is about 85%, but that's such a tiny percentage. So we've got to do an awful lot more to get these cases to court in the first place. And that means a much better treatment of victims and witnesses in those fraud cases. The chair of the bar, Mark Fennells QC, said the country has to decide whether or not it's interested in taking on the issue of fraud, and the Chief Executive Officer at CFAS, Mike Haley, said to us, it's surprising that there is no national strategy for fraud. There's an action plan, but there's not a strategy. It wouldn't be a bad thing, Minister, to upgrade the action plan into a proper fraud strategy and have a Minister with overall responsibility for that action plan. And then finally, Madam Speaker, going forward, we need to look at the role of the financial institutions in that high street fraud, in that credit card fraud. Very often they are running very, very profitable retail credit card operations. Again, a small investment, perhaps a willingness by them as responsible business people to contribute more towards anti-fraud measures might perhaps be a sensible and what we regard as a responsible type of business activity to assist again at the very significant costs which people have to meet. And finally, we do have to recognise that it's not just the big frauds which are international. The CPS, when they gave evidence to our committee, stated that 75% of the fraud that they prosecute, fraud crimes they prosecute, have an international element. That doesn't mean that they are Russian oligarchs or kleptocrats, but it may be that they're coming from foreign servers, for example, and it may be that there are foreign-based scammers hitting not businesses but individuals through insurance types of fraud, scammings of various bogus products and so on, but based overseas. We need to find means of improving our international cooperation and around tracking down those matters too. All of that indicates to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, that although good work is being done, it is not at the scale that is necessary or commensurate with the level of the problem and the harm that is done. Economic harm, but also I want to stress, as we heard very clearly as a committee, social and personal harm as well. And so I hope that we can use the opportunities coming up to redouble that. This debate is very timely in that regard, and I commend both the reports from the APPGs and I hope the government will take on board the responses that we will be sending to them, both to the Ministry of Justice and to the Home Office, from the evidence that we drew up only recently as a spur, I hope, to further and coordinated action. That's the most important thing. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Jim Shannon. Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's always a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman for Bromley and Chislehurst, and he always brings a wealth and breadth of knowledge to these debates, and we thank him for that. It certainly adds to the focus and perhaps the direction that we wish to go. Can I also put in record my sincere thanks to the honourable gentleman for Thurston Moulton and the honourable lady, right honourable lady, for Barking as well for their contributions, terribly helpful to this debate today, and we thank them for that. Others have contributed as well and have all added their experience and knowledge to this as well. The government stated in July 2020 that the economic crime represents a significant and ever-changing threat to the UK that has had a harmful impact on our economy, on our competitiveness, on our citizens and our institutions. It is therefore imperative for our own economic progression that we have an efficient strategy and proper guidelines to enforce punishment for economic crime. So all the right honourable members who have spoken have indicated just what direction we want to go and what needs to be done. I'd just like to start with some figures to give a real insight into the depth of the UK's economic crime. A total of 14.5% of the UK's annual 2 trillion GDP is taken in economic crime. To give you an idea of the magnitude of the issue, 190 billion of our losses come from fraud and a further 100 billion to money laundering. London has been described as a laundromat for corrupt money, and in 2019 the Treasury had found many failings in relation to legislative guidance on tackling economic crime. So we must, I believe, do more to ensure the resources are there to properly tackle economic crime. And they have clearly, at this moment, not been up to the level or indeed to the scratch, because hence the billions of pounds in theft that have been lost over the last period of time. I do look very much forward to the contributions from the shadow ministers, and in particular from the minister, who will endeavour to, as he always does, to answer our questions. In response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, government fast-tracked the Economic Crime Act 2022 to track down on the elites and on the dirty money in the UK. And as a result of the debate today, I'm hoping that the Minister will give us some updates on where we are and how that has improved, and perhaps maybe what other steps we can take here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to make and improve and do better. Government must tackle the economic crime as a much higher priority, especially as this comes to as a threat to our national security. And we've heard some discussions with that in the UQ this morning. We've had other discussions in this chamber and indeed in Westminster Hall on the very same issue. We've seen some of the most intensive sanctions imposed on Russia in our history to ensure that oligarchs and business owners cannot operate in an illicit manner outside of their own borders, and how important that is. A welcome step, but given that economic crime is on average some 40% of all crime in the UK, there is more regulatory action that we should take. It's seen that we must have a strategy that encompasses all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The honourable gentleman for Thurston Moulton referred to the Panorama programme. to the dirty money that came from Estonia right through across Europe and ended up in Northern Ireland in one of the banks there. And I, in my intervention, referred to the regulation is very clearly there for those who are domestic customers, and I understand the reason for that, and in no way do I say it shouldn't happen. But I do feel quite questioning the issue, Madam Deputy Speaker, just how does that happen? And is it down to the bank in particular? It just happens to be the bank that I'm a member of, and I do know some of the regulations that the bank can enforce upon their customers, and I'm one of those, and I understand those. But whenever you hear this £200 million movement, it does concern me. It also tells me that while paramilitarism in Northern Ireland has been very significant in the money laundering, in the crime and criminal activity that they're involved in, whether it be money lending, whether it be protection money, whether it be drugs, whether it be in the case of the IRA and along the border, fuel laundering, all those things. And government has tried significantly to address those issues. But many of those paramilitary groups, of course, have bought properties and businesses across the whole of the United Kingdom, and at that level. So I would really love to see, through this legislation, a more focused attention to those paramilitary groups. Who are the criminals living off the backs of the local communities that they state that they protect, but they don't protect. They take advantage of and they brutalise. So for me, as an MP from Northern Ireland, I'm really keen to see how this legislation can squeeze the paramilitaries from both sides of the community in Northern Ireland who are taking advantage of good local people. We also need to take into consideration the impacts of cryptocurrency. Again, I'm not an expert in cryptocurrency, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not sure if who is in the House, but I'm sure there are many who are. I'm just not one of them. And personally, I have little or no knowledge of it, but I am an old-fashioned in that I'm the cash, cheque and credit card now since COVID-19 came in, and I prefer to use the cash if at all possible. But this is becoming cryptocurrency is becoming a more popular mode of financing among the younger generations. I don't think there's a week that I don't see some story in some of the local presses, the national presses here, warning about cryptocurrency, and I'm not sure if the warnings are heeded. I'm not sure if the regulation is there to ensure that people don't get caught in it and maybe in a sting in it. So again, the Minister will give us his valued knowledge of cryptocurrency and what has been done to regulate that, monitor those involved, and to ensure that we do not go and find some of our constituents in bother. A proper regulation of the crypto assets. There must be intense efforts, I believe, to ensure that people are not misled by the thousands of online scams that there are in relation to online money. It's all very easy sometimes, Madam Deputy Speaker, to make your decisions on a screen in front of you, but once you push that button, that decision's made. So people need to be aware of that. In addition, consumers have lost an average of £754 million to online scam. I've been contacted by numerous constituents who have been the victims of a scam. Indeed, I suspect, Madam Deputy Speaker, yourself and others in this House have constituents who have been the victims of scams as well. Unfortunately, and it is unfortunate, that there probably not a week passes where someone in my constituency finds themselves a victim of a scam, whether they're caught in its entirety or stopped in time. But police are always, every fortnight and back home in the local press, the police issue a statement warning of a scam, the latest scam, the people who are calling on your doors, the online scams, and people are by and large fairly trusting. More often than not, most of these people who are being hacked and who are involved and find themselves the victims of online scams are those of an elderly and vulnerable generation. I know just a few months ago there, I had one constituent, an elderly gentleman, who lost some £30,000 of his savings just by being trustworthy, and found himself the victim of a scam. Again, these are the things that happen regularly, and the PSNI back home regularly advised to be careful. So be careful when you're putting your online information and you're using your bank accounts and what can happen. People are not aware of how big of an issue fraud is in the UK. And whilst our focus is often on the large scale oligarch type of dirty money and laundering, the very issue that the Honourable Gentleman referred to in the Panorama programme, we forget about normal consumers who are having money taken from them, and in many cases daily and weekly. So we must do our due diligence in this House today to ensure people are aware of the scope of the problem. And to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, and to give the front benches the time that they deserve to have for this, their contributions, I welcome the numerous actions that the Home Office and the Treasury and the Ministry and the Minister have taken to ensure that there is more efficient regulations and checks against potential crime to the economy. However, if we have seen substantial figures of money that comes to the UK either through fraud or laundered means, then action and severe action and regulation needs to take place. So we must ensure that the Treasury allocates the correct and sustainable funds, the staff, the necessary monies that are there to ensure to enforce the punishment against economic crime properly, as this is an issue, I believe, which is ever evolving and becoming even more advanced. So I would call again upon the Minister and Government to take this into consideration. I know they will. I know the Minister will. And I'm very sure that the answers we'll get will answer some of the concerns that we have. So when we look to the future, policies to tackle economic crime, I do, and put on record, I do praise the Minister and Government on all the work that they've done thus far in tackling economic crime, but I believe we need to be smarter than those who seem to try and outsmart us each and every time. Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you so much.
SNP spokesperson Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is a pleasure to come here this afternoon, even though there's all the chaos in politics outside of here, that we come together and have a very good debate with very comprehensive ideas and solutions to the ongoing issue of economic crime. And I thank the honourable members for Thurston Malton and from Barking for coming together as they have done to bring us this debate again, because whenever we have debates like this in this place, quite often we all agree, and it's to the Minister then to how he responds to all of our comprehensive agreement and suggestions. Because I've often been in rooms and discussions around economic crime where all of the experts in the room, they have those solutions, and it's the government that is way behind in implementing them. And I urge very much the Minister to work with his colleagues and others to bring those experts together so that we are actually going to get to some kind of solution here, because it feels like the entire time I've been in Parliament we've been talking about this and there has been relatively little action. And I think the point about enforcement is absolutely crucial to this, because the government can have the best rules in the world, but if it's not going to follow through with that enforcement, and it hasn't in many cases fallen through with that enforcement, there's almost no point having those rules at all, because if criminals realise that they're going to get away with it, it doesn't actually matter. And I'm sure the Minister will in his response reference FATF and the things that were said about FATF, but again the gap is in the rules, and between the rules and the enforcement, between what FATF have said about the UK and its regime and what the actual reality is on the ground. And it was highlighted very well by a number of speakers actually that things move quite fast in this area as well. And the honourable members for Thurston Malton and from Strangford both mentioned crypto exchanges and cryptocurrencies, and it is a fast moving, fast developing situation, and it also means that money can move fast and move further away from people in a very quick way, and being able to trace that then becomes incredibly difficult. And it strikes me that perhaps the government also needs to get further into the expertise of this sector as well, because those criminals, those who want to do the scams and the financial crimes, are always several steps ahead of the government on the technology, on the skills, on the expertise, and it takes government and takes legislation an awful long time to catch up with that expertise and that the fraudsters have had. And the issues that were raised around inaction fraud have been made very clearly by many people, and it's been a problem again for years. And the Scottish Government doesn't pay into action fraud, I understand, because they don't see the value in it. They get nothing for it, and instead we look to our own police forces to deal with that. And I'll talk a wee bit about that as well, because we have a crime campus at Gartcosh just outside of Glasgow. And when the Assistant Chief Constable Patrick Campbell came to the Treasury Select Committee to give evidence on our economic crime inquiry in early 2021, he talked about the crime campus and the value that it had. 27 enforcement bodies in one location. People that can speak to each other as they go about their business, people who can communicate and are made to do so because of the useful way in which that's set up. He also talked about Scotland's Economic Crime and Financial Investigation Unit, detailing that 150,000 officers that are tasked with serious and organised crime in relation to that high-level fraud, and 117,000 people on the front line gathering that information, making sure that people have people that they can go to report those crimes as well. And it is a contrast, certainly, with the fragmentation across a whole plethora of UK agencies. And the Treasury Select Committee report highlighted that as well. There is nobody who has proper responsibility, proper oversight for economic crime in the whole of the UK. And that really does show when it comes to the enforcement. There have been some very good suggestions put forward as well, and I welcome the suggestions for more executive responsibility and liability for economic crime. That failure to prevent economic crime is absolutely crucial to it, and the comparison with the Health and Safety Executive was made, and I think that is actually quite a good comparison, because if nobody is responsible for it and nobody's accountable for it, it's very difficult to see anybody doing anything about it. And I would extend that, and some of the evidence that we took at Treasury Select Committee reflected in this as well, to social media companies too, because that is often where an awful lot of fraud is happening these days. And I went to one of the events that gets held in this place, this time with the TSB, and the TSB sent me some more information about the levels of fraud that happen on social media platforms, and they reported that between January and March 2022, 70% of fraud came through Meta companies, 24% in Facebook and 46% on Instagram, 4% in Snapchat and 23% of frauds on other social media platforms. Now, why are Meta not being held to account for the fraud that happens on those platforms? Because it's not Facebook, it's not Instagram, it's not Snapchat that has to pay up for those frauds that happen to people. It's the banks. It's not the bank's fault. They're not facilitating this fraud. The social media companies are doing so, and they also... I will, absolutely.
She makes a very, very important point, and the point about the failure to prevent offence, of course, it doesn't just apply to the banks. It could also apply to the companies she talks about, which are facilitating the scamsters, who are then facilitating the crime. So it will also apply to the senior executives in those organisations she refers to.
Agree, and the point that he made about the fraud coming through on his WhatsApp, you know, there's a real problem there. Those frauds are happening on those platforms. If those platforms didn't exist, those frauds perhaps would happen in a different way in a different place. But there's a real responsibility there that social media companies ought to be taking. And TSB said that around the highest of those frauds within that period was a £3,000 fraud done to somebody on a social media platform, and the average amount of fraud was £415. And that's a lot of money for people to lose. Many people on social media might not be on particularly high incomes, but they're buying and selling across marketplaces. Frauds such as advertising a games console, which is just a games console, so people pay the money over and it never arrives because it's literally just a picture of a games console. And somebody will then try and pass that on to somebody else, and more people get scammed of it. It's a real issue, and purchase scams in particular, TSB ran a sample across a week. 67% of those purchase scams were happening on Meta, and I think the government needs to do an awful lot more to understand the levels of those frauds, how those are happening, and how you go about chasing them down. And I think there's an awful lot more that can be done in that regard. Moving on to the issues that the Honourable Member for Barking so excellently set out and comprehensively set out around kleptocrats, around Londongrad, around the money, the dirty money washing around through the City of London and other places. The government, again, should be seeking the experts on this, getting them to come in, exploring with them through experts like Oliver Bullock and other journalists who have done so much to expose this. Why is it still happening? Why is it still being allowed? What opportunities are there in the Economic Crime Bill to actually nail this down, to do more than what they have done so far? Because the first Economic Crime Bill, a welcome reaction as it was pretty small scale. let's be honest, and there needs to be an awful lot more done. There needs to be more done, of course, on Scottish limited partnerships, as I often mention, which have been used so well to facilitate that fraud, and that fraud has spread as well, as it does. If you push down the bubble on the wallpaper, it comes up somewhere else, to Irish limited partnerships. What discussions has the government had with the Irish government about what our failure to tackle this has done to their limited partnership system? And what progress and what dates can he give on the register of overseas entities? Because we've talked about this again for years and nothing has yet happened. The Scottish equivalent has now been set up, is now operating, and the UK government is behind. And what impact on the wider economic system? What impact on sanctions and what impact on Russia? And I understand Bill Browder spoke this week and said that the UK is the world's biggest destination of dirty money from Russia. There has not been a single prosecution of economic crime for Russians in the UK, not a single one. Why is that? And what is the government doing to ensure that nobody can get off scot-free? And while I'm here, I want to talk just briefly about Companies House, because I always do, and I will continue to keep doing until this gets fixed. Because Companies House, Madam Deputy Speaker, is utter guff. The register is full of complete nonsense. And will the Minister meet with Graham Barrow, who is an expert on this area, to talk about the timescales and the process for reforming Companies House? Graham Barrow pointed out that on Tuesday this week, 4,063 new companies were registered on Companies House. And that's not a sign of a booming legitimate economy, it's a sign that something is very wrong with Companies House. And as an example of this, Wendy Siegelman, a journalist, I think in the States, pointed out that a company was registered in Edinburgh in December 2020 under the name of President Donald John Trump. When she flagged this was Companies House, the response was, that person was no longer president of the USA at the time. That is entirely missing the point. I don't think Donald Trump is alive and registering companies in Edinburgh. I think he's somewhere else in the world doing other things just now. And Companies House should be taking these issues a lot more seriously. And more seriously for the government also, Martin Williams in Open Democracy mentioned that fraudsters have been exploiting Companies House to set up companies in the names of officials of the Ministry of Justice and HMRC. This identity fraud being perpetrated through Companies House should be of great concern to this government. Not just that it's government officials being affected, but anybody, Madam Deputy Speaker, you, I, or anybody else could be affected by a company being registered in our name, and then we become somehow liable for it, despite perhaps never knowing anything about it. Companies House reforms are well overdue, and it must be an anti-money laundering supervisor in its own right, as well as asking for verification for companies, for individuals as well. I could talk, Madam Deputy Speaker, for longer on this. I could talk till the cows come home, or we lose a Prime Minister, whichever comes sooner. But I will leave it at that, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's an awful lot to be done on this. The government need to listen to the experts. Get them in, get them around the table, figure out how to fix it properly once and for all, or give Scotland the powers to do so, and we'll do so ourselves.
Phillips. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a pleasure to be here, although this is not normally, I wouldn't normally be in this particular debate, but the security committees and various SIs and various things leave me here, and I would say very firmly that I have learnt a huge amount while sitting in this debate. I first of all want to thank the Right Honourable Member for Barking, my dear and honourable friend, for securing this important debate, and also to the Right Honourable Member for Thirsk and Moulton. The member for Thirsk and Moulton, I've written it down wrong here. I'm very glad that he took on some of the technicality about cryptocurrency, which my husband sometimes talks to me about, but I can't say that I am particularly across it. And I say that to highlight a problem that I think that also the member for Weston-super-Mare highlights, is that I think that we in this legislature and actually in our law enforcement are grossly behind in a digital world, acting in an analogue form, and the writing has been on the wall in this regard for some time, and I fear that we have not kept pace at all. What I I couldn't agree more with his speech about action fraud, and I believe it was the honourable member for Glasgow Central who called it inaction fraud, which is a considerably better way to describe it. But what surprised me most about his remarks were the record of banks that everybody in this country trusts, actually. Being fined so much money for money laundering of Mexican drug cartels, amongst many other things. And I think that he speaks for the nation when he expresses disgust about no criminal charges laid against banks. The public would be absolutely appalled to hear this, especially being, as has been pointed out by many members, how ready our agencies are to chase up people, all of our constituents, should they be falling foul of anything in particular. His solutions were good and well thought through, and I am an absolute fan of a preventative duty, as the Minister opposite may very well know. I think that we have to act to put preventative duties in place to make those who are considering turning a blind eye and taking the fines because they've got big pockets. We need to actually firmly place this in their wheelhouse. The Right Honourable Lady for Barking, who will be so missed by this House when an election comes, which could be, in the next 25 minutes, she has been an absolute giant in the fight against dirty money. Her call that there can be no prosperity for our country that is based on dirty money is one that should be taken incredibly seriously. We cannot sit back and act as if there is some prosperity, there is some reason to turn a blind eye because of the receipts into our nation, when she is telling stories like the one she told about the situation in the Lebanon. I, as a British citizen, and every British citizen in my constituency, I do not want my country being used as a place to hive off the interests of people who are making barrel bombs for Russia and Syria to kill people who then have to flee to my constituency. I do not want that. I never want to hear a story like that again. If anyone thinks that our prosperity should rely on that, it harms our nation, and we must act. She reminded us about the heinous reign of murder and suspicious deaths that is linked to dirty money. This is not just about receipts, especially where Russia is concerned. The chilling idea that Russian killers had been able to kill at will in the United Kingdom because of a reliance on dirty Russian money. She highlighted some of those cases, and just this morning we had to have an urgent question in this House because at the height of one of those murders, the poisoning in Salisbury, we do not know whether our then Foreign Secretary and now Prime Minister, not sure, we do not know who he was meeting with. In fact, no, sorry, we do know who he was meeting with. He met with Alexander Lebedev without officials, without putting anything on a public record. These are dangerous instances where we are lying down in the face of what my right honourable friend clearly highlights is not just dirty money, it is murder and deceit. She reminded us that enforcement is abysmal, and if I could give her some assurances that she is not alone in calling this enforcement abysmal. Enforcement of all crime in this country is utterly abysmal. It is no surprise to me that economic crime is falling foul of the same dreadful regime of falling charging, falling conviction, failing cases. The NCA is, in the face of this, facing cuts of 20%. So the Right Honourable member from Barnet's concerns about her ability, about their ability, is not about to get any better. Both of the members who have led this debate compelled us to take seriously the APPG recommendations, and so we on this side of the House absolutely will. The member for Cheadle speaking up of the importance of whistleblowers, and once again this is something I would totally agree with, especially when we're hearing about whistleblowers dying mysteriously. It is no small thing to step forward about crime, but when we're talking about crime with organised crime, the highest level of protection is undoubtedly needed. And my neighbour and friend from Hodge Hill made an impassioned plea that we in the UK should be leading the world on ending this corruption. Instead, we have advertised ourselves to Russia as a safe haven, and much more must be done. The government's economic crime bill is long overdue. For far too long, our country, and particularly our capital, has been a hotspot for dirty money. It doesn't need to be overdue from what I've heard in this chamber today. All the amendments are written by, whether it's the Justice Committee, as highlighted by the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, whether it is the APPG reports variously from different APPGs on whistleblowing and fair banking. We have the Foreign Affairs Committee. We have the Treasury Committee making recommendations. Good work has been done. So why is that economic crime bill so overdue? The illegal war in Ukraine and Russia's aggression has brought that into sharp focus, but let's be very clear, it should not have come to this. The National Crime Agency said in 2020 there was a realistic possibility that money laundering alone in the UK was hundreds of billions of pounds annually. The first economic crime bill was delayed for years, with the government blocking Labour amendments which would have reformed Companies House and left Russian oligarchs with fewer places to hide. I think that the member for Glasgow Central highlighted quite what is going wrong in Companies House for the House to hear. Meanwhile, economic crime continues to rage across this country. Fraud now accounts, as has been said, for 40% of all crime, yet less than 1% of police resources goes to tackling them. Millions of people are scammed every year. Like so many other crimes, nothing is done. Only 1 in 1,000 fraud offences are prosecuted, and the Serious Fraud Office made only 2 convictions in 2020 to 2021. Just 2, which is 1 more than the government managed to prosecute on child trafficking, because that was just 1, to the point that enforcement across the board is down on every form of harmful crime. Has the Minister ever tried to refer a crime of fraud? Many members have talked about their constituents and, in fact, themselves. And I'm here to tell him that I have, as there was literally a person using my name and my details to book a hotel. I knew because they were checking into the hotel and it appeared on a Google calendar of mine and at the time. And I know that they checked in because I did the sleuthing, because when I tried to report it, I mean, I might as well, I won't swear, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I might as well have not bothered. Yet I was able to ring that hotel, find out that somebody had checked in. They were literally in the hotel when this was happening, and nothing was being done. I'm a Member of Parliament. Imagine what it's like for somebody who is not a Member of Parliament. I got absolutely nowhere. We are still waiting for the fraud strategy. The member for Strangford, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst have both mentioned the fraud strategy. Where is it? We are waiting for it from the Home Secretary. When it comes to fraud, the government and the Home Office, I'm afraid to say, have been missing in action. Now, I know it has been a stressful day for the Minister. His entire government has collapsed around him. He's one of the few ministers left standing, one of the few ministers who hasn't had to cancel parliamentary business today. But despite all of that, I shan't let him off the hook. I'm hoping he will take this opportunity today to just answer a number of important questions, many of which the opposition have been asking for many months. Will the second economic crime bill promised in the Queen's speech be introduced before recess? Or will this important bill meet the same fate as so many others? Will this bill, like the Victims' Bill, be promised in multiple Queen's speeches before we even see it in draft form? Will the Home Office finally bring forward a fraud strategy, a promise the Minister the minister, potentially not this particular minister, but a minister, made months ago? Or again, will this be a promise broken? Will the Home Office finally action fraud, which anyone who has fallen victim to fraud will know is completely failing? And if so, will the Minister update the House on what steps are being taken to replace it with something that can actually function? Given the National Crime Agency's hugely important role in tackling fraud, will the Minister also today rule out that a 20% staff cut that they have reportedly asked the NIC to make will not happen? I think.
Minister Kevin Foster.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's certainly an interesting day to be responding to this debate. And like the Shadow Minister, this isn't my usual field, but I had agreed to respond to this debate about a week ago. It's always nice to have those. Always nice to have those comments from the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. It's always a pleasure when she joins us. But in terms of the debate, I want to start by offering my thanks to my honourable friend, the member for First Malton, and the right honourable member for Barking for securing this debate, and all the other members who have contributed, including even a rare chance to hear a contribution from my good friend, the member for Strangford. We all agree that economic crime poses a threat to the integrity of our economy and to the security and prosperity of the UK, along with our allies. And let us not forget the innocent victims who suffer both emotionally and financially at the hands of unscrupulous fraudsters. Economic crime, as outlined by many who contributed, affects more UK citizens more often than any other crime type. And we've had examples given today. Now, the UK, we do have one of the world's largest and most open economies, and London is one of the world's most attractive destinations for overseas investors. These make the UK attractive for legitimate business and contribute to our prosperity. But we also accept, that the government does accept, that this does also expose the UK to the risk of money laundering via some of those processes. Now, the Public-Private Economic Crime Plan published in 2019 provided impetus and directive for our collective efforts in this area, including through strengthened law enforcement and increased cooperation domestically and internationally. And there has been progress in tackling this threat. For example, in recent years, we've built some key capabilities, including the creation of the National Economic Crime Centre and substantial reform of the Suspicious Activity Reports regime. As touched on by a number of members in the debate, we've enacted the Economic Crime Transparency and Enforcement Act 2022, introducing reforms to enable law enforcement to take more effective action against kleptocrats who launder their funds in the UK. And we have legislated for a levy on the anti-money laundering regulated sector, which from next year will raise £100 million a year to help us combat economic crime. But look, I hear some of the concerns from colleagues this afternoon on the potentially fragmented nature of the enforcement landscape. Yet I would emphasise this does not mean there is not joint and coordinated working between the law enforcement agencies concerned. The ever-evolving and clandestine nature of economic crime does require a multi-agency response, drawing together the relevant expertise, capability and resources to effectively tackle this challenge head-on. We believe, as the government believes, the National Economic Crime Centre plays a leading role in setting the strategic priorities for the enforcement response to economic crime and very much bringing agencies together. And the NECC leads intensification campaigns to prevent, prepare and protect against economic crime and to pursue those responsible for it. And coordinated by the NECC, the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force serves as a world-leading model of best practice, enabling tactical and strategic intelligence sharing between the public and private sectors to better tackle economic crime and support high-priority operations. But we very much recognise the need to go further, as many members have set out, and I'll briefly give way.
I noticed his theoretical description of what happens, but the practice, if anybody who puts any allegation that we get from whistleblowers into the system, it does just get passed from one of the agencies to the others, and it then falls down a black hole and you never hear about it again. So whilst theoretically cooperation and coordination take place, in practice it doesn't. And the other thing I have to say to him is, if in practice the system was working so brilliantly, why are prosecutions down so much, and why are convictions down so much when we know economic crime is going in the opposite direction?
Well, we would accept that there's a need to go further and certainly look forward, certainly following today's debate, to the debates we'll have on the forthcoming bill, where I think from what we've heard today, members across the House will have thoughts and opinions and valuable contributions to make in terms of how we can strengthen our regime, both in the way it's legally constructed, but also in terms of the direct impacts it has. And we recognised in the 2021 spending review the need to invest in this area, and the economic crime levy, combined with public contributions, is now an overall package of about £400 million to tackle economic crime over the next 3 years. And we have, for example, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the National Crime Agency established the new Combating Kleptocracy Cell to specifically combat corrupt elites, their dirty money, and those which enable them to abuse our financial system. And we do recognise we need to further empower law enforcement through the forthcoming Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill, which will be designed specifically to tackle economic crime, protect our national security and while supporting enterprise. And the bill will include some much needed reforms to Companies House and limited partnerships, including Scottish limited partnerships, with additional powers to seize suspected crypto assets more quickly. And a number of... Briefly.
I welcome all reforms of Companies House, but will he put it on a proper footing and make Companies House an anti-money laundering supervisor in its own right, rather than relying on third parties to do that function?
Well, certainly we'll set out in the details of the bill and we'll look forward to the debates on them, but certainly we're clear that the Register of Companies' powers should become more of an active gatekeeper over company creation and custodian of more reliable data, including powers to check, remove or decline information submitted to. She, rightly in her contribution, gave the example of someone setting up a company as Donald Trump. Well, clearly that wasn't a legitimate company being established. Some who missed that particular things. And it's about the fact, but it's, again, part of the changes are, one, identity verification. It's certainly in my normal role of talking on immigration, that's something that we do quite a range of work on, ensuring people can validate who they are, what their status is, and about bringing a lot of that practice into the area of company formation to remove some of the worst examples we've heard today. I accept that's something that many people will see as overdue, that it needs to be done, but it's certainly something that we intend to legislate on and bring forward as a key change to our enforcement structure and to ensure there's less opportunity to abuse the system of company registration here in the UK. Now, there's been comments about the National Crime Agency's resources. We have increased its budget year on year since 2019, and taking all NCA funding into account, their budget has increased by 32% since 2019. In terms of the criminal liability laws, which a number of colleagues picked up in this afternoon's debate, following the concerns, we have sought to establish whether there was a case for change. I think it's the member for Bromley and Chislehurst who referred in particular to the Law Commission and the review that we'd asked them to undertake. As he rightly says, they've set out several options for reform. He outlined his view that he'd like to see us accept them. I said we are assessing them, but certainly that is something that we specifically asked them to do, because we believe that's something where we do need careful consideration. Briefly.
Very way. I agree that he wants to assess them, but he will be aware that this debate has been ongoing actually for quite a number of years now. Well in advance of the actual reference to the Law Commission. It's been debated in political circles and in legal and judicial circles for a great deal of time. So there's a huge amount of information there, so you can come to his assessment, I hope, very quickly.
The honourable member for his contribution. Obviously, it would be very tempting for me with the dispatch box today and in the current situation to make a raft of pledges on behalf of the government of all the things I might like to see, see happen. But probably at this stage, I'll say that I would share his enthusiasm that we can come to the conclusions of our assessment fairly quickly. Now, the honourable member for Cheadle in particular talked about whistleblowers, and we very much recognise the value of whistleblowers being prepared to shine a light on wrongdoing, and we believe they should be able to do so without fear of recriminations. And what I would make clear, workers can seek redress through the whistleblowing regime if they are dismissed or suffer detriment because they've made a protected disclosure, and it's worth noting uncapped compensation can be awarded by an employment tribunal to reflect this. And if a whistleblower does not feel they can blow the whistle to their own employer, they may make a disclosure to a prescribed person, and there are over 80 prescribed persons, and the Department for Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy regularly publishes guidance for them and updates the list of prescribed persons. Yeah, certainly, very happy to.
I'm very grateful and appreciate the fact he's covering this brief. On the points he makes, if whistleblowing legislation worked, why is it that my constituent Ian Foxley, who blew the whistle on GPT special projects in 2011, and that company was fined, found guilty last year, £28 million in financial sanctions? Why is it it's been out without a single penny in compensation and without a penny of earnings for 11 years? The legislation isn't broad enough, isn't all-encompassing, it needs reform, and it needs it urgently.
Well, as always, my honourable friend makes a powerful case for going further, and he'll be aware the government's committed to review of the whistleblowing framework. We're considering the scope and timing of this review, and certainly we'd be very happy to engage with my honourable friend about how that can be taken forward effectively, particularly given examples like the one he's cited, although he would realise that I wouldn't necessarily want to comment on individual cases from the dispatch box. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this has been a helpful and productive debate. I want to reassure colleagues that the Home Office and the Treasury, when leading the policy response for the government, do ensure that we do this versus a governance structure which oversees activity across the system. And this isn't the only area where our two departments work together in the national interest in terms of delivering the overall objectives we wish to see. And in closing, I would again thank members for their contributions in this debate. It is an immensely important subject. It's an area where we will shortly see significant legislation brought before the House for colleagues who I know will wish to scrutinise, examine and develop. Certainly from what we've heard this afternoon, there will be many positive and constructive engagements in that debate, and it's one that we very much look forward to taking forward, because as touched on, this isn't just about tackling crime, this is ultimately about keeping our nation and its allies safe.
Having Hollinrake to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It has been an excellent debate, and I can thank all the members across the House for supporting the application for the debate, for the Backbench Business Committee itself for granting it, but also for the contributions today. I have learnt an awful lot, as well as the fact I've been looking at this issue for some time. Coalitions have a bit of a dirty word in our party, perhaps. I'm a big fan of them, actually. Can I invite all the contributors who've spoken to this debate, and anybody else interested in this issue, to work with us, our all-party groups, on this agenda, because we are not going away. We're going to make sure the future legislation we put together is fit for purpose. I think it's fair to say, for whatever reason, we have taken a blind eye to this issue for too long. Ukraine's been an eye-opener, because we've suddenly realised what this actually means and what this facilitates. Economic Crime Bill Mark 2, and I welcome the Economic Crime Bill Mark 1, but Mark 2 is coming along, and what the reforms will come from that. But I urge the government to look at the Economic Crime Manifesto, include what it can in there, and also provision other areas, particularly on failure to prevent, particularly on whistleblowers, particularly on beefing up and coordinating and strategising our resources. It's great to see so much cross-party agreement on this. All the work of the Justice Select Committee, the Treasury Select Committee, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, are all party groups, MPs and peers right across whatever the political spectrum. It's time we opened our eyes. We have been a world leader in facilitating economic crime. We want now to be a world leader in fighting economic crime. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Point of order, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On a point of order, and can I just also reassure Madam Deputy Speaker that I have informed the Minister of my point of order. I hope you'll be able to advise me on how to shed light on a series of confused and potentially misleading comments made by the Prime Minister and his Minister regarding Alexander Lebedev. During his appearance at the Liaison Committee yesterday, referring to a meeting in April 2018 in which he met with Alexander Lebedev, the Prime Minister stated, "I have certainly met with him without officials." This is a significant revelation and something no government minister has ever commented on under questioning. But during the urgent question earlier today, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister appeared to contradict the Prime Minister's claim that officials were not involved, saying that the Prime Minister did inform his officials. Later in the debate, she received word from the Prime Minister that he thinks he told officials. We must get to the facts, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is a question not just of integrity, but demonstrates a complete disregard for British national security. So what action can be taken from the Chair or by members of the House to ensure that ministers keep their promises to us, to the Crown and to the British people to allow us to get to the facts of this whole murky business?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable lady for her point of order, and I note that she said that she did inform the Minister quite correctly. It isn't for the Chair to determine on these matters, but the government front bench will have heard what she has had to say today, and I hope that they will pass back that we would expect the record to be corrected if it needs to be. In addition, the Table Office may be able to advise the Right Honourable lady of other ways she might like to pursue the concerns that she's raised today. Thank you. Thank you. We now come to the debate on alcohol duty and tax on alcohol. Alan Cairns to move.
I beg to move this general debate on alcohol duty and tax on alcohol. I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for Gateshead and the Backbench Business Committee for selecting this important topic for consideration, as well as to all of the members of across the House who supported the case that it should be considered. Now, this debate is hugely important to a large number of businesses across the country, the hospitality sector in general, brewers, vineyards, distillers and retailers, employing hundreds of thousands of people. A disproportionate amount of them will be small businesses and with younger employees too. So getting this policy right really matters. I want to start by paying tribute to the government for recognising this Brexit opportunity. Taxation and alcohol duty has been needlessly complicated for too long, yet the UK was tied to EU restrictions preventing change. The government has set out its intentions to review the structures. They set them out in March 2020 and followed with a consultation on its proposals in October last year. The government's stated aims are to make the system simpler, more economically rational and less distortive, and to reduce the administrative burden. Now, and it's fair to say that these positive intentions are included in the thrust of the proposals as they have been set out. The consultation is welcome because it creates the opportunity for Honourable and Right Honourable members and the industry to respond and to further develop the plans as they're set out. My comments, Madam Deputy Speaker, are aimed at encouraging the Minister to refine the proposals further now that the industry and consumers and officials have considered how they would work in practice. In relation to beer duty, there has rightly been a warm welcome for lower duty on draft beer. There's also been a recognition that the proposed 5% reduction should also apply to kegs and casks of 20 litres rather than the 40 litres that have been set out. There's been a strong indication, I would say, from the Treasury that this may happen, and I ask if the Minister is able to confirm her intentions when she responds. I would also press for a greater reduction than the 5% a pint in order to support the industry and pubs further in particular. New research published just this week has highlighted that England and Wales has 7,000 fewer pubs than it did just 10 years ago. And we all recognise the important role that pubs play in our community, in our society in large, and also providing a watching influence on people who enjoy to have a drink, rather than merely being encouraged by the cost incentive to drink at home. The plan to widen the reduced rate from 2.8 to 3.4% ABV is also a positive move. But again, a minor adjustment to 3.5% would resonate much better. This would enable the industry to innovate further and to help protect smaller brewers from the larger operators who may simply adjust their recipe to take advantage. It is important that relief, as they currently receive under the small brewers relief, fully applies at this level. It would also make this element competitive with EU directives too, and provide further support to the small businesses within the industry. I would happily give way to the honourable member.
And for those who have brought this forward, it's a very, very important issue, and commend them for that. The last few years have impacted greatly upon the local pubs, upon the bars and the restaurants. They're the ones who have suffered. At the same time, Tesco's and Asda's, as two examples, can sell extortionate amounts of alcohol with low tax. Yeah. Others are left suffering. So does the honourable member feel that within this, the steps that government is proposing, and the Minister will speak about later on, that our pubs can pick up the business that they have once had and have lost through lowering their alcohol taxation and encouraging people to support local? Does the honourable gentleman agree that's a positive way forward?
The member makes an extremely important point that encourages what I said, some people to drink more at home because of what the large retailers can offer at discounted prices. But I would also add that both in Scotland and in Wales, I'm not so familiar with the position in Northern Ireland in relation to minimum alcohol pricing, where the retailers are the ones that receive the extra differential in comparison to what is available in England. So this gives some room for the Treasury to be able to react in a positive way to support the pubs and the brewers, as the honourable member and I seek to underline. The small brewers relief has proven to deliver major benefits. It enables small brewers to compete with larger operators and to innovate and to generate new options for consumers. This will be replaced by the small producers relief in order to offer similar or common benefits to the wider sector and to prevent the current cliff edge. Now again, the government's objectives here are positive, but I'm concerned that the proposed changes introduced significant complexity to the process. Moving from 5,000 hectolitres at a 50% discount to a maximum of 2,500 hectolitres at a 100,000 maximum up to 8.5% ABV, along with a cash limit and an average ABV measure, is much more complicated than it needs to be. It's hard enough to say, let alone follow the process. It also makes it much more unpredictable for the businesses that we're seeking to encourage, to innovate and to invest and to create wealth at the smaller end of the scale. So, I will give way to my honourable friend.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend? It's an important issue, and he's making a powerful speech about it. I was particularly interested in his point about broadening this from just brewers across to the wider sector. In particular, the cider sector, very important in the West Country. Thatcher's Cider, based in my constituency, are complaining on behalf not just of them, but of many other small producers about the massive increase in complexity which this collective set of changes has introduced. It may be easier to understand at a high level, but for individual firms, Martin Thatcher has written to me saying huge increases in red tape and bureaucracy brought in as a result of these proposals will result in a need for increased staff to manage monthly excise duty returns, and goes on to talk about the increased costs of that burden. I hope he's going to be able to address that and persuade the Minister to respond.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for the point he makes, and I think that the significant advantage the cider industry receives as it stands is testament to the campaigning that my honourable and right honourable friends from the South West have made to the industry because of the differential in the taxation status, and there are some who call for that to be addressed, but that is not proposed in the government's plans, and I'm not suggesting that that should change, but I think the honourable member makes an extremely important point about the complexity. So even when there are potential advantages to some sectors over another, the complexity detracts from that, and I think that the simpler the process, the better that would be. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the Minister agree that the current proposal as laid out is too complex and a simplified approach would work much, much better. The principles or broad approach of this incentive are important, and I ask why there is no similar support for UK vineyards as well, all of which in the UK are small operators. These are businesses that invest for many years before receiving a return on their investment. The quality of wine competes on par with traditional winemaking countries and wins. Now, Llanerch Vineyard and Glyndŵr Wines in my constituency are excellent examples. They invest heavily, have long lead times, are excellent employers, and are as well great visitor attractions. In reality, they are small operators, and extending either the principle of the small producers relief to include vineyards, or simply by increasing the current arrangement, albeit simplified, from the 8.5% ABV limit would make a major difference and provide significant advantages to wines made in England and Wales. Support to such vineyards here in the UK would not pose risks or undermine the Treasury's ambitions and can be met within the WTO rules. The same principle could also apply to small... I will give way to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend for giving way, and this is something very specifically which has been raised to me in my constituency by Bolney Wine Estate, very particularly impacting them and other nearby producers in my honourable friend Lewis's patch in terms of Ridgeview, on the edge of my patch as well, and in regard to Kingscote in East Grinstead. There is a collective ask across the English and Welsh wine industry, and I hope the Minister on the front bench will be able to help these businesses to grow, because they are small producers and tourist attractions, but above all, businesses.
Grateful to my honourable friend for the extremely important point that she is making and underlining the issues that we've highlighted. I warmly welcome the proposed... I'm limited on time, but I will give way very briefly to the honourable member.
Limited time, but look, could I thank the honourable member for giving way, and as a member of Camera, welcome the comments that he's made about the brewing industry, and if we do get that reduction to 22, then that will be very welcome. But on wine, he references rightly British vineyards, which are a great success story. But is he also concerned that in our trading relationships with many of our strongest allies, in particular when the government is undertaking a trade deal with Australia, and Australian winemakers who are seeking to diversify from their market in China, it's enormously, they're very concerned about the new complexities being introduced. Does he think that the government ought to be engaging with the government of Australia and other similar countries where our trading and security relationships are so important?
I think the honourable member makes an extremely important point. Not only is it in relation to important to businesses, as he's rightly recognised, but it's also about the international influence that these policies bring about, and his wider experience, both geographically as well as on security issues, is recognised right across the House, and he makes an extremely important point. So, as I warmly welcome, Madam Deputy Speaker, the proposed abolition to the additional tax on sparkling wine. This is particularly helpful to producers in England and Wales. 70% of wines from the UK are sparkling, and the current EU system works against them, particularly as smaller operators. So this is another Brexit dividend. The wider proposals for duty changes on wine are also have positive intentions, but in practical terms, as they stand, will leave much more complexity again in the system. The 3 current rates per bottle will be replaced by a total of 27 separate amounts per bottle, assuming that it applies to the labelled ABV. We must recognise the fact that winemakers cannot dictate a specific level of ABV. It depends on seasonal factors. Therefore, the structure of taxation should take this into account too. The administrative burden will fall particularly hard on UK retailers, particularly specialist merchants that tend to carry small supplies of a wider range of products. A small retailer, for example, could have a range of 2,000 to 3,000 different products. The variation between different vintages would also mean they become swamped in red tape, a policy that runs against the positive intentions the Minister and the Treasury has. There would also be a need to take into account permitted tolerances. Now, the good news, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the minor adjustments can achieve the government's objectives and simplify the structure for the industry. All wines fall within the spread of 8.5% to 15% ABV. Establishing such a spread and applying a common rate would simplify the process and give the Treasury the clarity it needs. The industry believes, for example, that a rate of 12%, which would be a 4% increase on the current rate, would be a win for the Treasury, but also a win for them because of the reduced red tape. And that demonstrates the point that was highlighted about the cost of the red tape earlier. I would emphasise, however, that it may sound logical to say compromise instead of the high number of splits in the range between 8.5 and 15. Why not maybe have just 2? But that will not work out either. It might sound logical, but the complexity would remain. And similarly leave tolerance challenges as it would previously. So, just to finish this point, so taxing at one rate would help the Treasury achieve its objectives by providing clarity, but also support the industry significantly. I will give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Can I say I entirely agree with him, particularly on this point. Company in my constituency, Direct Wines, have stressed of the dangers to their business if these changes go ahead. So does he agree with me that this debate should also be delayed until we've had much more chance to talk to people about how this will affect their businesses?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he makes an important point about the complexity of the system, particularly in relation to the wines and the variations of the ABV dependent on the circumstances. I'm torn by the argument on delay, because if we can get this right, because it's only minor changes they need, let's get them as quickly as we possibly can. But clearly, as they stand, we wouldn't want to see them introduced. So if they have to remain, then it's better to see them delayed in relation to wines. So it's something of a challenge, and maybe the Minister could offer some sort of indication of how long she would expect it to take to see these changes. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, these issues are technical and complex, but are hugely important to industries that employ and entertain millions of people across the UK. Previous Chancellors have often made a name for themselves by working closely with the drinks industry on such technical issues, and have delivered a huge boost to employment, investment and society at large. And it's also gone down very well with the popular press when they get it right, because of the popularity of the alcohol sector, and rightly so. So this is an opportunity to do the same. The intentions are right, the structure is logical, but the changes along the lines that I've highlighted would ensure that this important industry can continue to develop, can continue to grow and deliver for all our constituents. I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm incredibly pleased to be able to speak in this debate. I would like to speak about beer, cider and fortified wine, sometimes known in some parts of Westminster as a work event. The former Chancellor's relief scheme for draft beer and cider excludes far too many small brewers and cider producers who need the most help. The ill-thought-out proposal to impose the 40-litre minimum container size to qualify for help has obviously been dreamt up by someone who really has absolutely no knowledge at all about how pubs up and down our country operate. Almost all craft and small batch beers are kegged into a 30-litre container. That's 6.6 gallons, if anybody is still wanting to introduce imperial measurements. And a small 4.5-gallon cask for real ale, a pin, holds just 20 litres, as do many ciders, which are delivered to pubs to dispense in 20-litre bag-in-a-box containers. 34%, Madam Deputy Speaker, 34% of licensee stock products in containers are smaller than 40 litres to improve beer quality and choice for customers. 46% of venues said that some products are only available to them in containers less than 40 litres, and 1 in 10 venues can only stock containers less than 40 litres, as they don't have the cellar space to sell the larger ones. So I do hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Treasury can finally own up to the fact that they have plucked this figure out of the air and instead give small brewers, cider makers and our struggling hospitality industry the break that they need. I would ask if the Minister could confirm today that the industry is going to get the much-needed assurance that the threshold will be lowered to 20 litres after all. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to talk about fortified wines, because the forthcoming changes to the duty regime will have a significant and arguably disproportionate effect on pork producers in particular. In my constituency, I have one of the UK's leading distributors, Fells. They're a major employer in my constituency and in Hertfordshire more broadly, and they are braced to see a dramatic decline in their sales should this go ahead. Aside from the dramatic price increase that will follow the changes, there are very real and legitimate concerns about the implementation costs and the increased red tape. The system changes, the administrative burden, ongoing compliance with such a system will have further negative effects. The government's objectives of this alcohol duty reform consultation were welcome. It wanted to simplify the regime and reduce red tape, but the proposals simply do not do that. For wine, the proposed model cannot be described as simpler. Introducing taxation by degree will be complicated, costly and impractical. Unlike other categories of alcoholic drink, there is a far greater permitted tolerance for the alcohol content for wine made from fresh grapes, meaning that without testing every wine at the point excise duty becomes payable, it is not possible to accurately determine alcoholic strength. Introducing such a system will disproportionately hit the wine-dominant or wine-exclusive small and medium enterprises, importers and retailers who are an important element of the customer base for my constituency organisation, my constituency business, Fells. They are requesting that the government conduct a full and thorough cost-benefit analysis of the impact on the wine sector, and that this cost-benefit analysis should take place as a matter of urgency before any new system is introduced. And I'll be grateful for assurances from the Minister that they would indeed consider running this cost-benefit analysis. Additionally, under the current proposals, the suggested model actually penalises warmer climates as well. There are very limited tools available to vineyard managers to keep ABV down to an acceptable degree, and production rules actually forbid winemakers from removing more than 2% ABV. I understand that the Minister has met with the Wine and Spirits Trade Association, but they are also seeking further meetings because they are looking for an assurance that the government may consider instead a more workable way of taxing wine by applying a flat rate based. They're suggesting a flat rate based on 12% of ABV for all wine and 18% ABV for all fortified wine. Let me just talk as well about port and sherry, because the government's proposals would have a particularly negative impact on the fortified wine business. The total UK market for fortified wine is £311 million. Within this, port represents £82 million, and Fells, in my constituency, is the leading UK importer and distributor. The government proposals would add £1.09 duty to a bottle of port. That is an 11% increase on the average price per bottle. In a highly price-sensitive market, Fells estimates that such an increase could lead to an 11% decline in sales, roughly 1 million bottles per annum. And we know that fortified wines like port and sherry are generally not consumed irresponsibly. They're bought and consumed at festive occasions and celebrations, People buy them to mark exams and graduations and weddings and anniversaries and at Christmas. They're an occasional treat. But with the cost of living emergency, we know that treats are often the first to go. And therefore, this regime could have a huge impact on this market. So I ask the government to think again, to consult more, and not to rush this through, and to do that cost-benefit analysis. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do believe that overall the alcohol duty reforms that are being proposed by the government are really just tinkering around the edges in dealing with the pressures that are facing hospitality. We have a broken business rate system that penalises pubs, restaurants and high street shops. We have spiralling energy costs which remain uncapped for small businesses. We have food inflation and labour shortages. I would ask the government to seriously consider bringing forward a proper plan to protect British brewers, distillers, winemakers and their distributors. Thank you.
Very much. Flip Drummond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate my honourable friend for the Vale of Glamorgan for securing this important debate. It's a pleasure to speak on this debate on taxation of alcohol and the government's review. And can I first declare that I'm chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Wine GB. I am also fortunate to have some fantastic producers in my Meon Valley constituency who will have an interest in these policies, both brewers of beer, cider makers and, most importantly, vineyards. I have kept in close contact with them throughout the process of the consultations and review, and the points I make here are heavily influenced by their comments to me over many months. In Britain, we are increasingly a maker and exporter of wine. Our tastes as consumers, technological advances, and we must face it, climate change, have driven change and growth in the industry. And I very much welcome the removal of the super tax on English sparkling wine. We have some brilliant vineyards around the UK. Hambleton Vineyard in my constituency is at the forefront with their award-winning wines. This will help them develop the market at home alongside their continual success in the export market. Because vineyards face high start costs, and in the case of sparkling wine, up to a decade of careful work before they have a wine that they can market. I was pleased to see that the vineyards of Sussex, that they've recently achieved protective designation of origin, and I hope that their counterparts in Hampshire and other counties will be able to achieve a similar designation. And I will do whatever I can to help them get that recognition of their excellence. So in view of the challenges that winemakers and merchants face, I do think we have to look again at the proposals on wine duty. I appreciate the desire to simplify what has become a very complex regime. It dated from times when we neither consumed as wide a variety of wines, nor so many of them made of around 70% of wines, and it would affect many SMEs in the wine trade. It would also create a regime of 27 different bans, as we've already heard. The burden this would impose on independent wine importers and merchants is a mountain of red tape at a time when we're trying to reduce that generally. I know the Wine Spirits Trade Association has put a range of proposals together which they've put to the Treasury on wine and spirits, including bringing small producers of wine and spirits into the small producers scheme available to brewers and cider makers. But a solution which I favour could be that we have a duty based on the 12% as the midpoint in the 8.5 to 15% range. This would cover 3/4 of all wine. And fortified wines have a midpoint of 18%, and that provides a logical basis for another band. It would also tie in with the global market, which regulates all wines between 8 and 15% as just one product. Turning to brewers, I'd particularly ask the Treasury to look again at Make It 20 campaign, which SEBA are leading. The introduction of the draft duty rate has been welcomed across the industry and by Camera, but supporting smaller brewers has been a long-term aim of the government. But in order to get the best out of draft duty rate, we do need to move the container size it applies to down to 20 litres. 20 and 30 litre containers are mostly a mainstay of supply for small brewers, and with the limit at 40 litres, there's a good chance that many brewers would miss out. And when we come to look at the health of the pub sector, we know that consumers want to see smaller brewers represented. YouGov had recently surveyed pub drinkers and found that more than 3/4 of respondents cited this as an important factor. Turning to cider, which was also mentioned earlier by the honourable gentleman for Somerset, one of the Western-super-Mayor. This is an area of business which has benefited most from government support in recent years, and I'd urge the government to act on the same level for our winemakers and brewers, because cider is a great British success story, and talking to cider makers such as Meon Valley Ciders, I look forward to them going from strength to strength. And pubs faced a tough time during the pandemic, and I argued strongly for restrictions on them to be lifted as quickly as possible. I wanted them to be able to carry on off sales while they were closed for on sales as well. During the pandemic, the sector initially recovered strongly, thanks to the Chancellor's eat out, buy one, get one free, I think it was, can't quite remember. Eat out to help out, thank you. But even with the good weather that we're having this summer, it is clear that pubs and restaurants are still operating below the pre-pandemic level. A figure of minus 20% is a figure that we often see mentioned. And this does leave a potential black hole in their margins, which are tight at the best of times, with some fairly rapacious major businesses in their supply chain. The macro brewers and pubcos have not been good friends to the pub trade, which is why it is vital that we support our smaller producers. The Treasury has generally taken a constructive attitude throughout this process, and I'm confident that my colleagues will continue to make sure that we get the right policies in place to help our small brewers, cider makers, and particularly vineyards.
Thank you. Mr. Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it's a real pleasure to speak in this debate, and I congratulate my right honourable friend, the member for Vale of Glamorgan, for securing it at such really a vital time for so much of the sector. It's a pleasure in particular, obviously, to speak as chair of the all-party parliamentary group for beer and brewing, the largest all-party group in Parliament, because a lot of public focus is given to the very real harm that can be caused by alcohol and by overconsumption. But not enough attention is given to the very real contributions that British beer and our community pubs pay to almost every element of life. They genuinely are, on balance, forces for good. They're a force for good economically, with beer and pubs contributing about £23 billion to GDP nationally, and as I'm sure the new Chancellor will become very aware, about £13 billion to the Exchequer. They are present in every single one of our constituencies, every part of the country. We have about 1,800 brewers, or possibly more, across the UK, including about 150 in the West Midlands. My own constituency is home to at least five breweries. And these make huge contributions to our local economies. They're a force for good for employment, with beer and pubs employing around 900,000 people, with an almost identical gender balance, and around half of those people employed across the sectors being aged under 25, and with fantastic varieties of career progressions across the industry. They're good for tourism, with British pubs being consistently named as one of the top 3 things that visitors into the United Kingdom want to do whilst they're in Britain. And they're good for exports, being the 3rd highest food and drink export sector, worth around £550 million for the UK economy, and before the pandemic, growing more quickly than almost any other export sector. And they're good for our society and for culture. At a time where loneliness and isolation are often the biggest challenges facing some of the most vulnerable people in our communities. In many areas, the community pub really is the last of the services in those towns and villages. It is... Of course I'll give way.
Thank my honourable friend for raising both the opportunities, the career, managerial and long-term opportunities in the sector, but also around the charitable and good will and fundraising that happens in many of our pubs. I recently went to a Brave the Shave in the Borough Arms in Haywards Heath, and they were raising masses of money for Macmillan Cancer. And this sort of thing goes on up and down the land, bringing people together and bringing good causes and goodwill together, equally as well as a good time.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and Pub Aid estimate that pubs up and down the country contribute more than £100 million every year to charitable activities and to community causes, and a further £40 million for grassroots sports in our constituency. So they really are forces for good in our communities. But they have our pubs, our beer, brewing, and as my honourable friends have said, many of our other producers, other parts of the sector, have long been overtaxed. UK pubs and brewers are taxed around 20 times more than US tech companies compared to their turnover. They're taxed around 5 times more than UK gambling. The UK has one of the highest levels of beer duty in Europe, behind I think it's only Finland and Ireland, but 10 times that of Germany. Taken together, our pubs and brewers contribute over £10 billion over £10 billion in tax last year, even in reduced market conditions. 1 in every £3 that's spent in a UK pub does go straight to the Treasury, which I'm sure the Minister will be very grateful for, but I'm sure that members will also recognise the disadvantage that the burden this places on those responsible places for people to drink responsibly and in moderation when compared to the opportunities that particularly supermarkets and other off-trade retailers are able to sell their products far, far cheaper with far less employment costs and far less in terms of their responsibilities to regulate who they're selling to.
On that point?
Of course.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Honourable for giving way. Would he agree with me that it is an absolute travesty that around 10,000 pubs and restaurants could be lost if there are not more fundamental reforms to the tax system that is affecting UK hospitality? Many of them are saying that the pressures they're facing now are even worse than they were during the pandemic. Would he agree with me that we need to go much further than just the alcohol duty reforms?
Well, I think there's obviously been a very long-term trend in moving away from drinking in pubs and on trade towards supermarket sales as shares of the market. Now, some of that will be natural changes in consumer preferences and people's lifestyles, but we shouldn't be allowing the tax system to aggravate those trends where they have such real social and economic consequences. So I think where we can tweak the tax system, make sure that our pubs, our brewers, our other producers are getting a fairer deal, and that this can reduce some of the disincentives to be consuming drinks within well-regulated public houses, then I think we should do so. I do welcome the alcohol duty review. I think it is a massive step forward because, of course, as well as the duty, the level of duty, which, as I've said, is much higher than most comparable countries, all of that is, of course, compounded by not only VAT, but also extremely high levels of business rates. So I do hope that we will be able to look at how our system of local business taxation can be further modified. Clearly, the Treasury have been piloting attempts to to charge digital and online companies as a starting point, and I think that's an important starting point. But we do need to make sure that our taxes on clicks are comparable to our taxes on bricks, so that those sectors that are by their very nature have to be, they operate in the real world. Nobody has yet established a viable online virtual pub. I know a few tried during the pandemic. I don't think any of those experiences quite worked out, and I think it's very noticeable that most people come, when was it, April, May last year, were very quick to get back to the real thing rather than the online equivalent. But on the duty review, the reforms that are being proposed are hugely welcome, particularly, I say, the banding that recognises the progression as you go through alcohol strengths, so that higher strength alcoholic drinks pay not quite exponentially more, but certainly progressively more levels of duty compared to low strength drinks. The changes to the low alcohol band for beer from 2.8 to 3.4 will make a big difference in terms of the availability of good quality lower alcohol beer. It is relatively simple for brewers to change recipes to bring down a 3.6, 3.7% real ale down to 3.4, much easier than it is to get it down to under a 2.8 threshold without changing the character of those drinks. Although I do agree with my right honourable friend that 3.5 would clearly be preferable if we're looking at those details. Similarly, on the proposals for small brewers relief, I think that what's being proposed is hugely preferable both to the system we currently have, but also to the initial proposals that the Treasury had brought forward that I think would have caused a lot of difficulties for relatively small breweries. I think these changes, whilst I accept that they take a while to get your head around, and I think that's probably putting it lightly, I think the distorting effect that the current system has with its sharp edges that act as very strong disincentives for growth, that impose an unnatural plateau around 5,000 hectolitres, that mean unless you can be confident that you're going to grow significantly beyond 5,000 hectolitres, you have very little incentive to invest in the extra staff and the extra capital to do so. I think the system that's proposed is far better, and it is very noticeable that what had long been probably the most contentious issue within the beer sector has now actually brought people, whilst there are some details each of them might like to change, the overwhelming majority of the sector now feels this is something that they can live with. And I would suggest that perhaps the Treasury might like to look at whether some form of small producers relief might be possible for wine producers as well, to extend it beyond beer and cider, to include small wine producers, which I think would also have a particular benefit for English wine producers. And, of course, Welsh wine producers. And for the SNP bench, I'm sure that I don't know the scale on which Scottish wine producers are operating at the moment, but I would imagine that Scottish producers would probably fall mostly within the smaller category. And finally, on the proposals for the differential rate of beer duty, the draft beer duty rate, and this was a fantastic proposal that the previous Chancellor announced in his budget last autumn. It has the potential to make a big difference to supporting responsible drinking within our beers, our pubs, our cafes, our bars, instead of our supermarkets and, let's be honest, our park benches and town centre street corners. The difference it can make will depend on the scale of that differential. The 5p differential is a good start in establishing the principle, getting a new system up and running. It's likely to mean that almost all of that differential is retained within pubs and brewery, which in itself will typically mean around a £2,000 additional investment available to pubs. But if we want to see consumers, beer drinkers, benefit from the draft beer duty rate, that differential is going to need to be widened. I think it's only really once you get to the 10-15 pence stage that you start to see a real difference in what customers are paying for a pint at the bar, and that's when it also has the difference in encouraging people to drink in regulated on-premises instead of buying from the off-trade. So we'd obviously like to see that increased. We'd also, if possible, like to see it introduced at the first available opportunity. I know that the Treasury were looking at something being introduced probably in spring of next year. Given the difficulties that we all know that the hospitality sector have had over the past 2 years or so, if a suitable fiscal event or financial instrument was to be found that would allow this to come into force before this year's Christmas season, it would make a massive difference in helping the pubs that the Honourable Lady for St Albans was referring to, that may be struggling, may be on the edge of either going under or just about managing to stay afloat through the winter. I think bringing this in early would make a big difference. Now, clearly there's been a very lively debate over container size. 20 litres is very obviously the correct answer. I think from discussions with the previous Chancellor and previous Economic Secretary, I think that they recognise the 20 litres was also where this needed to end up. I very much hope that incoming ministers will now reach the same conclusion. I think actually the previous Chancellor broadly accepted the argument that 40 litres was probably not the right container size for the threshold when he was pictured with the Prime Minister holding 30-litre containers to launch the policy. So 20 litre will make a big difference to the range of particularly our smaller brewers, the types of beer that can be made available, but also I think we need to look at the provisions on distribution mechanisms so that they don't necessarily have to be connectable to either a gravity-pulled or electric-pulled draft system, that the pins of the kind that you see typically in beer festivals in all of our constituencies, where it's just a tap in the side of a barrel, if it's over 20 litres, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'm talking to some of our brewers. They estimate it's less than 0.1% of their beer is sold through those taps. We're not risking seeing a massive distortion in the market from people buying huge numbers of them for parties at low rates of duty. It is a minimal cost to the Treasury just to make it apply to all containers over 20 litres. Clearly, the system that they've introduced in Australia a few years back that does have a requirement for the connectors. As partly the Australian market is very different. They also have a much lower threshold. I think it's as low as 8 litres from memory. But I think 20 litres will capture virtually all of the beer that virtually all of the small brewers that we're trying to support, that supply through our pubs and our licensed premises, they would benefit from this. So I would hope that the Treasury in their final decision will settle on that as the obvious figure. Once again, I thank my right honourable friend. I thank the Treasury for all of the discussions that we've had over the past couple of years, and particularly since the publication of the duty review. And we look forward to these measures being introduced quickly so that our brewers, our publicans and UK hospitality as a whole can benefit, succeed and thrive.
From bench wind up, Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I say what a pleasure it is to speak in this debate and to congratulate the honourable member for the Vale of Glamorgan on securing it. I'll begin my remarks by declaring my membership of the all-party parliamentary group on Scotch whisky, and also say how pleased I am to see, after a day of turmoil, that the Minister is in our place. I'm going to have to get to grips with two other ministers that I shadow, so it's nice to see some continuity somewhere in at least one area of the responsibilities I have for my group. Alcohol duty is something that I think has been ripe for review for quite a considerable period of time, on the grounds of complexity, on the grounds of the